Guys, welcome back to another video. In this one we're doing first part of What If Ichigo Time Traveled. Now this is going to be a short series. Just let me just get my mouth back to working because I was just sleeping until like maybe 4 or 5 minutes ago. So yeah, I'm extremely tired. And yeah, hope you all guys enjoyed this video. And yeah, let's get into it. So yeah, hope you all guys enjoy it. And yeah, let's go.
The war was over. Aizen had won. 19-year-old Ichigo stared pensively up at the sky, sprawled on the ground outside Urahara Shoten. A stabilized garganta in the sky allowed hollows to come and go as they pleased, terrorizing the residents, and there was nothing he could do. Even if he could purify all the hollows, there was nowhere to send them. Soul Society had been completely destroyed. The Karakura town, indeed any town left at all in the real world, was literally a ghost town. What was all his training for? All his power, all for naught. So what if he could materialize his hollow mask at will, and keep it on for as long as he had Ryotsu left? So what if he had come to a truce with his inner hollow, who had agreed to fight alongside his king? So what if he could defeat the Primera Espada single-handedly? No matter what he did, Aizen was always ahead of him. He had failed them. He had sworn to protect them, and he had failed them. Ever since the Overlord had gotten his hands on the king's key, the resistance had stood no chance. The last of them, if they even could be termed a resistance at all, had gone into hiding behind Urahara Shoten's extensive wards. The last haven safe from Aizen's clutches, thanks to Tessai. It was all his fault. The deaths of his friends, the way his father stopped smiling, Yuzu's new ability to see spirits, Karen's tears, the haunted look that never left Yuriuki-san's eyes nowadays. They had all lost the ones closest to them. They had all blamed themselves in some way. And they had all found different ways to cope. Yuriuki had developed an aversion to bees and spent more time in her cat form than human form nowadays. No one saw Kisuke for weeks on end when he cloistered himself in his laboratory and worked himself to the bone to find a new way, any way to kill Aizen. Ishine talked compulsively to the poster of Masaki, the only item to survive the bombing of the Kurosaka clinic. Ichigo laid on the grass and stared up at the sky wondering what he could have done differently. If only he had become stronger faster, become stronger before Aizen had a chance to destroy everything he held precious, none of that would have happened. He was the only one who could match Aizen, the only one not caught in his Zanpakuto's illusions. Four fully fledged Shinigami and an odd motley crew against the new Soul King and his army of minions. It was clear that the war was over. But could he really sit and wait for death? After all the people who had sacrificed their lives for him? Ichi and I called Yuzo, appearing at the door of the Shoten and interrupting his musings. Dinner is ready. I'm not hungry, Ichigo replied without thinking, still caught in the what ifs. Instantly, his sister's face crumpled. Ichigo hastily changed his mind, standing up and dusting himself off. Yuzo cooked compulsively. It was her way of coping with the war, and Ichigo had no intention of disparaging it. Then the world exploded. Ichigo threw himself in Yuzo's direction as the roof shook violently. Before he could reach her, however, the ground rocked again and the walls folded, sending the roof crashing down. Ichigo cried out sharply as he hit the ground, splinters of wood cutting into the arms he instinctively brought up to protect his face. Silence, save for the debris settling around him. Lying face down on the ground and breathless, Ichigo tried to extend his Ryotsu to see if it was an ambush. He found no Arrancar presence, which reassured him enough to check his immediate surroundings next. There was a weight lying over him and sticky fluid was soaking into his hakama. Blood. But if he was bleeding, why was there no pain? And for that matter, the weight on top of him was too cold to be simply wood from a broken piece of furniture. It was almost as if. Ichigo slowly turned his head to the right to meet golden irises. Yo, Abo, his inner hollow rasped, almost immediately coughing up more blood. Specks of black hit Ichigo's cheek but he did not flinch. Why? He whispered numbly, why did you save me? Ichigo coughed again, the familiar grin appearing on his face. Ma, a horse needs his king. Anyway, I'm the one with all the instant regeneration. When he had been 15, had anyone told him that his hollow could be self-sacrificing and rational, Ichigo would have recommended them to the nearest asylum. That was before he had held the Hogyaku in his own hands, trying to get the orb away from Aizen, and it had thrown the last of its power into him. Ever since then, instead of an inner hollow, the more accurate term would be an inner Arrancar. Complete with a resurrection, though Ichigo still preferred to swing his white zanjutsu around. Fitting, given that had his mother not been hollow-fied, Ichigo would have been his Zanpakuto spirit. Footsteps sounded. A few seconds later, hands gently lifted the weight off. Ignoring the pained groan from his Aaron car, Ichigo twisted around and sat up, gingerly taking Ichigo into his arms, trying not to exacerbate the pain the other must be feeling. "Thank you," he whispered to his white counterpart, whose hakama was stained nearly totally black with blood. Ichigo shot him a lopsided smirk, closed his eyes and vanished in a spray of reishi particles. "Are you all right, Ichigo?" Shihoin Yoriyuki asked, crouched in front of him, in human form for once. Absently, Ichigo registered that she must have just assumed human form to help get Ichigo off him, for she was not wearing anything, but he had long become accustomed to it and no longer freaked out like he used to at age 15. There were far more important things to worry about than nudity when you were doing your best to keep someone alive just for a moment longer, buried up to your elbows in their abdomen. Between maintaining someone's modesty and saving her life, you cannot defibrillate a woman in a bra. Not even Urahara Kisuke has invented such a device yet. No one would pick the former. He had personally seen Ishine rip someone's shiakusho open to perform cardiopulmonary resuscitation, manually forcing her heart to beat, long enough for one of their preciously few healers to arrive. Hell, there were times he himself had been carried back, unconscious and Ryotsu almost non-existent, his shiakusho nothing more than tattered strips barely clinging to him. Ichigo answered, picking the splinters out of his arm and turning his head to the shop front. "What about you?" The words died in his throat. Ishine was several steps away, eyes transfixed on what had formerly been the doorway of Urahara Shoten. Yuzo was in a tiny ball, arms wrapped around her head. Ichigo could almost believe she had survived the explosion, had there not been several long pieces of wood digging into her. He turned away, unable to continue looking, only to spot Karen. His other sister had one hand outstretched towards Yuzo, face twisted in pain. She had obviously tried to do the same thing Ichigo had wanted to, but had no inner hollow to protect her from the flying debris. Even as he stared in mounting horror, Karen's spirit shattered into reishi particles and disappeared. Bare feet padded hurriedly across the ground, skidding to a stop. They stopped. In the silence, the sharp sucking in of breath was deafening. "Kisuke," Ishine murmured. "Almost pleasantly, if that's one of your experiments gone wrong, I'm going to kill you." His father's Ryotsu had been climbing steadily throughout the speech, hand shifting to Injetsu's hilt, and for a moment it appeared as though he would attack regardless of Kisuke's reply. "It's not," Urahara Kisuke replied, equally quietly, gray eyes for once not drooping in exhaustion. Some small part of Ichigo, the part not numb with shock at the sight of both his sisters' deaths, was surprised. Kisuke had obviously gotten some sleep recently, a feat he thought the former shopkeeper no longer capable of. He was about to inquire after the change when "S.A. Sato-kun," came Orium's panicked voice. Ichigo was not aware of when he started running, only that he was running towards her voice. "Not Chad. Please. No." The scene he stumbled on stopped him in shock. Chad was sprawled on the ground, left arm buried in the chest of an Aaron car. The same kind that had killed Ishida Uryu. Its ability to mask Ryotsu was probably how it got past the wards around Urahara Shoten in the first place. Tessai would have to upgrade. No, Tessai was dead, killed in a skirmish last week. Shaking his head sharply to dispel the images that featured most prominently in his latest nightmares, Ichigo focused on the present. Orium had stopped screaming, and was simply rocking back and forth, hands fluttering in agitation as an orange dome briefly enveloped Chad before disappearing. For all her powers, she could not bring the dead back to life, and the Shunrika knew that. "Kurosaki-kun!" she exclaimed, jerking her head up. It was her eyes that drew his attention, eyes filled with helplessness and despair and terror. "Inu," Ichigo murmured, because there was nothing else he could say. His voice appeared to break her out of the horrified staring, and she crumpled onto Chad's chest, sobbing hysterically. "Why wasn't I strong enough? Fast enough? I could have blocked it, could have done something." Hands clutched weakly at her hairpins, pulling them free. "It wasn't your fault," Ichigo started, kneeling beside her and stretching out a hand to comfort her. Through her muffled weeping he could barely hear her next words. I regret not being able to do anything. Ichigo." Ichigo had barely a moment to realize something was very, very wrong when Orium screamed, her head snapping backwards, and for the first time he took in the chain dangling from her chest. The broken chain. Then her Ryotsu mutated. Ichigo threw himself backwards, eyes wide with horror as the hollow, Inu, this was Inu, swiped blindly at him with new two sharp claws. His awkward former position afforded him little balance as he toppled over, barely putting any distance between them. Ichigo fumbled for Zanjutsu, already knowing he would never manage to raise the Zanpakuto in time. Nake, Benihime. Claws scrabbled off a blood-red shield, a fraction of a second away from ripping off his arm. Then Kisuke was suddenly in front of him, blocking Hollow Orium's frenzied attacks, while Yoryuki, who had yelled his name earlier, was dragging him out of the way because his legs were too numb to move. How could he have missed Orium's soul chain earlier? She regretted. Strongly enough to turn her into a hollow, he wanted to say, but the words were stuck in his throat, lost in the turmoil of emotions threatening to claw their way out of his chest. Is there any chance she might become a vizard? Ichigo asked, clinging on to the last shred of hope he had. In response, Yoryuki simply gave him a small, sad smile, eyes fixed on Kisuke's back and the newborn hollow. But she has Ryotsu too and Ichigo trailed off, unable to finish his half-hearted protest. Orium had never been a Shinigami, and thus she could not become a vizard. His mind knew that, but his heart could not bear to accept it, not when that would mean the last two of his friends were truly gone. Why? He managed breathlessly. Silence met his rhetorical question, only broken by the sounds of Benihime against claws. Ichigo blinked, his attention finally focusing on the pair now that he belatedly realized that the battle had been going on far too long. He identified the reason a moment later. Kisuke was merely defending, not attacking. He turned a questioning gaze on Yoryuki. She reminds him too much of Hiri, murmured Yoryuki, gaze never leaving the duo. Suddenly Ichigo understood. The reason why Kisuke always did his best to dissuade Orium from participating in the battle, why he refused to spar with the girl, why even now he could not bring himself to attack the hollow she had become. He blames himself for her death, he whispered. Yoryuki said nothing, eyes riveted on Kisuke. Hollow Orium growled again, one paw crashing into the blood-red shield Kisuke called up in time. And she is your friend, Ishine spoke up and Ichigo jumped. He had not even sensed his father approach. She deserves to have you look her in the eye. Kisuke tilted his head sideways, one gray eye searching out Ichigo with unerring accuracy. A hint of emotion flashed through the visible eye, an emotion that Ichigo recognized. Pain. He saw it in the mirror every day. Kisuke was suffering just as much as everyone else. The man had jumped in to save Ichigo from a possibly fatal blow, but in doing so he had forced himself to raise his Zanpakuto against someone he had failed to protect. The reminder of someone else whom he had failed. In that split second Ichigo knew what to do. His hand scrabbled blindly for Zanjutsu's hilt, swinging it down at the Getabashi's back. Getsuga Tensho. With a quick burst of Shunpo Kisuke flitted to the side, allowing the weak version of the attack to smash right into Hollow Orium. She screeched in surprise, one clawed hand flying up to touch her mask, which was already crumbling at the edges. The mask took an eternity to shatter, each broken fragment revealing more of Orium's tear-stained face. I'm so sorry, she whispered, still clutching her hairpins as she dissolved. I wish this had never happened. And the world spun out of focus. Back when there were more of them, they had taken the battle to Hueco Mundo. All the seated officers of the 11th Division had volunteered to be part of the assault. They charged at the front, Kenpeki in the lead, Yachiru is always on his shoulder. The one who kills the most of those bastards gets treated to all-you-can-drink sake. He had yelled to the wildly cheering division. A flash of red. A spray of blood. In the midst of the chaos darted a tiny figure, whose speed and agility enabled her to avoid the brunt of the Aaron Car's blows. Any who ever questioned Kenpeki's decision to promote Yachiru to Fukutaiko had all of their doubts erased when her Ryotsu exploded around her, painting the surroundings scarlet. Kenpeki, Yachiru, Ikeku. Ichigo had to watch them fall. Bankai. Thousands of vines erupted from the ground, wrapping around the Aaron Carr army. They screamed and writhed, fighting desperately to get out of the bindings, which drained them of all their strength. Flowers unfurled their blood-red petals, blooming wildly. Then the Ryotsu stored in the vines detonated. Yumi Chika. Heh. I win. Yamamoto Suteiko, who had sought out Aizen right at the beginning of the invasion, was not faring much better. They had been locked in a stalemate for so long, even after both had released their Bankai. Ryujin Jaco lived up to its name, burning away all but the illusions created by Kyoka Suijutsu. The Suteiko was concentrating so hard on breaking the deadlock that he failed to notice a sneak shot by a tiny Aaron Carr in his blind spot. Following his victory in Hueco Mundo, Aizen pressed his attack to Soul Society itself, backed by newly initiated Espada. Longtime friends Yukatake Jayashiro and Kiraku Shunsui fought back-to-back, flanked by their respective Fukotaiko. Twin pairs of Zanpakuto flashed in unison, until the new Arrancar scientist released a cloud of acidic smoke. Jayashiro had fallen to his knees in a coughing fit, blood splattering across his hand. In an attempt to block an incoming attack, Shunsui had thrown himself over his best friend. Twin pairs of Zanpakuto fell. Nel-sama. I want to protect them too. Pesha, Dondakaka, you're free to leave if you want. The two Fraxion stuck by her, even when Aizen personally made sure she would serve as a warning to any other Arrancar who dared to even entertain the thought of betraying him. Someone had the time and inclination to find a way to preserve souls before they dissolved into Reishi particles after death. Ganju and Kyokaka led Soul Society's last line of defense, fighting to protect their home. Fireworks mixed with Reikoho and Hiryogekazoku Shinton Reiho exploded in the faces of the advancing Arrancar with unerring accuracy, dealing incomparable damage. For a moment it even appeared as if Soul Society would succeed, until Hueco Mundo smashed into it and forcibly absorbed the entire world. They moved to the transient world, but Aizen was relentless in his pursuit, with no regard for the Espada who were by then replaced almost daily. Teiko, watch out! A deafening crash. Ichigo turned his head just in time to see a whole section of buildings collapse on where the 10th Division had formerly been fighting. Above the ground, higher in Meru suddenly gave an agonizing howl and shattered into pieces. Somewhere, Ichigo was sure, hell had just frozen over. All other battles ceased as Ichimaru-jin, formerly known as Aizen Sosuke's right-hand man, spun around and sank his Zanpakuto to the hilt into Aizen's chest. Jin-kun, how did you? You think you can possess me forever? Snarled the silver-haired man, blazing blue eyes fully open for the first time in many Shinigami's memories, as he yanked Shinso out savagely. Yashudne touched Rangiku. Aizen shook his head, almost sadly, as if he were scolding a recalcitrant child. Koros, Kamishinai no Yari. Such a pity, Jin-kun, if only you never woke up. Anohan Aretsu, who had been focused on mass healing the badly injured, was caught off guard when several of the highest-ranked Espada collaborated to fire one single massive Zero at her Bankai. She did not survive. Sui Feng, who had flung herself in front of an attack meant for Yoryuki, smiled as her Zanpakuto fell from her lifeless hands. The losses were not only restricted to the Shinigami. The difference was that Aizen could retaliate by creating more Arrancar, with different, dangerous new powers. While walking home from the store, Ishida Uriah was caught by surprise by an Arrancar with the ability to enact a shield with properties similar to Sekizeki. By the time anyone felt his Ryatsu, it was too late. Ishida Ryakan, mad with grief, painted the sky blue with Ryatsu arrows for 3 days and 3 nights straight. Several Vastolord numbered amongst his countless kills before he succumbed to the toll it took on his body. As the survivors quipped with respect, hell hath no fury like a Quincy scorned. Ichigo arrived home to see Renji sprawled across the doorstep, red hair spilling out of his hair tie like a macabre compliment to the blood liberally painted over his torture, those were signs of torture, body, his hakama in shreds and a Zanpakuto buried in his chest. His Jigai had been slumped protectively over the immobile forms of Yuzu and Karen. In a fit of blind rage, Ichigo had attacked the Arrancar responsible. It was only after he had ripped all 3 of them physically apart that he realized that Yuzu was still conscious and Karen lay in a Shiakusho, her real body bifurcated. Yuzu could see spirits from then onwards. It was supposed to be a simple mission. Run interference, raid Aizen's temporary base in Karakura town, and get out. Nothing ever went to plan, as the destruction of that base triggered a stabilized Garganta to open and outpoured thousands of Arrancar led by the latest Espada. Ichigo was separated from the other visored almost immediately. Lisa! Behind you! Love shrieked. Bankai, being such a Ryatsu leech, was never meant to be used for long. Ichigo reached out, trying to blast the wall of hollows between them out of his way, trying to do anything to get to the rest of them as one by one, they let go of their Bankai. The last visored's Ryatsu spiked once, twice, then plummeted. Somehow, even while falling Shinji managed to catch Ichigo's eye. A pained look flitted across his face as he mouthed, farewell. The hollows swarmed. Kisuke caught himself before he hit the ground, springing into a crouch born of centuries of ingrained training from his time in the Onmitsukido, Beniheim already unsheathed and Aikido ready on his lips. Though she made no sound, he felt Yoryuki's tightly controlled Ryatsu flare aggressively somewhere behind him, signaling her position. Only then did he take in his surroundings. Kisuke drew in a sharp breath, and heard Yoryuki do the same. It couldn't be, he stuttered brokenly, stumbling shakily forwards to press a hand against cool stone, exactly the way he had built it over 400 years ago. Here was the piece his clumsy adolescent fingers could never chip right. There was that group of rocks veined in minerals, that he had spent months painstakingly carving into the kanji for their names and then set into a bed of opal. He sank to his knees and traced the familiar characters that he could have written in his sleep, and sometimes still saw in his dreams. Coal for Urahara Kisuk. Amethyst for Shihoin Yoryuki. Jadeite for Tsukubishi Tessai. It felt real. That was what complete hypnosis would have him believe. At the stray thought, Kisuk jerked upright again so fast that his vision swam. His secret training grounds in Siriti was gone together with the rest of Soul Society, forcibly absorbed into Hueco Mundo. He had barely escaped through a hastily erected Senkaimon with his life. Indeed, half of his black Haori did not survive that final trip. He wanted to believe so badly that Soul Society, his home for centuries, had somehow been resurrected. But no, that way lay madness. Just like how the dead could not be brought back to life, Soul Society would never exist again. How like Aizen, to so effortlessly taunt and torture with one decisive blow. He would not fall for it. Breathing deeply and forcibly wrenching his violent emotions under control, Kisuk felt the slow burn of his rage creep up on him. In response, he loosened the tight hold on his Ryotsu. Let Aizen taste the bitter fury. Let him feel the bloodlust. Let him writhe in the 8 depths of hell where nothing in any world will ever be befouled by him again. Kisuk? Yoryuki-san. She walked, unafraid, into the maelstrom of his Ryotsu and laid a hand on his arm, heedless of the powerful winds tearing at her. Aizen cannot have her. Tell me something only Yoryuki-san will know. Tone icy, he did not look at her. Aizen cannot recreate what he had never known. It was the sole weakness of the complete hypnosis technique. A weakness that had cost Soul Society far too many people they could not afford to lose to expose, but it was the only certainty in the abyss of lies perpetuated by the megalomaniac who had had over a century to amass his arsenal of knowledge. His army of camera flies had ensured that privacy had been a myth. She stood on her tiptoes and whispered something into his ear. Confident in his ability to mimic every Shinigami with at least Shikai in the Godai 13, Aizen had sown the seeds of discord far and wide, pitting ally against ally, friend against friend, lover against lover. They would have lost the war that day in Hueco Mundo, were it not for one individual. Yay, Ken-chan is playing with Byakushi. Stunned by the shout, for a single moment, Aizen's perfect mask had cracked. An eerie silence fell over the battlefield as opponents eyed each other warily. Well, where's that Aizen team then? The newly revealed Kenpei growled. Huffing slightly, the little girl pointed without hesitation to someone whom by all means she should have taken to be Yukatake Jushiro. Over there, can't you tell? How can you tell? Demanded Ikeku. She blinked oddly at him. He doesn't smell like sugar. Uki always carries a bag of sweets with him. The one person whose intimate knowledge of the Godai 13 surpassed that of Aizen's, who relied on instinct to identify an enemy rather than logic in her eyes. Kyuzajishi Yachiro. Aizen had personally made sure she did not survive beyond that day. Kisuk's Ryotsu slammed back into him with the full force of the gales that had been surrounding him, leaving him breathless. There was no mistake, this was not one of Aizen's illusions. This was the real Yoryuki-san. This was Yoryuki-san and he had been hurting her. She raised an arm and beckoned to him regally, wordlessly requesting that he follow. He did so, and found himself in front of the healing pool that he had installed in his bid to replicate the rejuvenative hot springs in Kairanji Tenjiro's domain. She dipped an arm into the water, then lifted it out to show him the rapidly healing cuts. Aizen does not know of this secret training ground. The only ones who knew of its existence, other than the 3 of us, were Aburai Renji and Kurosaki Ichigo. Her voice was calm, an unwavering anchor in the turbulent ocean of his thoughts. Kurosaki Ichigo, who would have bitten his own tongue off before he betrayed them, and Aburai Renji, who had allowed himself to be tortured to death to buy time for Ichigo's sisters rather than abandon them to the errand cars. They would not have breathed a word of it to anyone else. Aizen did not know. It was real. A scream rent the air. 3 heads snapped towards the source of the sound, and 2 figures immediately rushed forwards. One hung back, eyes narrowing at the little details that caught his eye, mind going into overdrive. Aizen? No, hypothesis already rejected. Next theory. Judging from the intensity, if he was mistaken, if he was too late, Ichigo would either go insane from the pain or perish. He shoved that thought as well as the emotions it evoked away, and lowered the statistical level of significance. Internal damage? No known injury, No visible blood. Again. What was he missing? New observation, visible distortion of Reishi particles near extremities. New deduction. Conclusion. His mind whirred to a stop. Take him this way, he snapped, breaking into a shunpo-aided run towards his laboratory. Agony ripped through Ichigo, liquid fire coursing through every nerve. It was worse than the time Byakuya made mincemeat out of him with Senbon Zikura, worse than Ulquiorra slamming his Zanpakuto through his chest, worse than his last all-out battle with Ichigo before the newly turned Arrancar agreed to follow his lead. Make it stop. No one heard his plea. But suddenly, the suffocating pressure lifted, and a familiar Ryotsu wrapped around him like a parent soothing a child after a nightmare. He passed out gratefully. Consciousness returned in bits and pieces. Ichigo opened his eyes and immediately wished that he did not. His father's features swam into view. My precious progeny is awake. He proclaimed loudly, arms flung wide open and a goofy smile stretched over his face. Ichigo winced and opened his mouth to berate the other man, only to regret it a moment later as even inhaling proved to be too much for his body to handle. He involuntarily clutched the soft material covering him as he convulsed, coughing. Hands helped to turn him over onto his side, one large hand warm against the back of his neck, the other against his sternum. Ichigo breathed slowly and deeply as he fought to get his coughing fit under control. I'll get you some water, his father murmured, and a moment later his footsteps moved away. More mindful of his state, Ichigo eased himself into a sitting position, and only then did he realize what he had been lying on. His gaze traveled uncomprehendingly from the white haori clenched in his hands to the operating table bolted to the ground, and his breathing involuntarily quickened. No, not again. His Ryotsu rose in a tidal wave, and a small part of Ichigo that was not freaking out wondered why Aizen had left his Ryotsu unbound. The megalomaniac adored Sekizeki. There was a crash at the other end of the room, and footsteps came running. He would not go down without a fight. Ichigo flared his Ryotsu even higher in response, turning his head in the direction of the sound. And found himself face to face with Urahara Kisuke. The blonde was panting slightly, a sheen of sweat covering his face. His omnipresent hat and fan had both disappeared, and unveiled grey eyes shining feverishly. Perhaps what alarmed Ichigo the most, however, was that Kisuke had braced both hands on the operating table, and made no attempt to hide that it was possibly the only thing keeping him upright. Blonde hair flopped limply forwards into his eyes as his chest heaved visibly with the exertion under his shiakusho. Ichigo, it's just me. Ichigo frowned at his uncharacteristic lapse into informal speech, hesitating slightly. Even as he watched, Kisuke swayed slightly and nearly went down, barely catching himself on the table with an elbow with a sharp bang that made Ichigo flinch in sympathy. Ichigo made an aborted motion forwards to grab the other man before he fell, but Kisuke did not even seem to notice. I'm sorry about the facilities, but there was nowhere else to put you. Grey eyes flickered up to meet his. You know I will never hurt you. Kisuke-san. He could trust Kisuke-san. Unless. Prove it, Ichigo murmured softly. He was nearly sure this was really the Getabashi, nearly sure he had never seen Kyoka Suijutsu released before. Nearly was what had gotten everyone else killed. The blonde head lowered. Ichigo tucked his feet underneath him, ready to move, to help or to fight, he did not know. If you dodge, I won't let them cut me. The words were soft and breathless, but clear. If you protect someone, I won't let them die. His legs buckled and nearly gave out, and this time Ichigo shot forwards to grab the other man. Together, they dragged Kisuke's torso onto the table. If you attack, I'll cut them. Can you see? The resolve to cut you reflected in my sword? Ichigo finished the sentence together with him quietly. The slamming of a door, and more running footsteps. Is something, Kisuke, what are you doing? The other man managed a tired smile. Couldn't let your son destroy my precious laboratory in a panic attack. Ishine shook his head, almost shoved the mug he was holding into Ichigo's hands, and bent to lift the other man fully onto the table. Ichigo scooted backwards to make room, watching intently as his father took the blonde's pulse while Kisuke laid there disturbingly pliantly. Just don't get up for a few hours, his father eventually instructed. Until Yuaki-san gets back. What happened? Ichigo finally asked. Ryotsu exhaustion, Ishine replied shortly. A combination of being overworked, general stress, a lack of food and sleep, and far too many combat pills. He moved over to Ichigo, taking the empty mug from him and placing it on a nearby table. Feeling better? Ichigo considered the question. Yes, he replied in surprise. Was that water from the healing springs? Now that he actively thought about it, the bitter mineral taste was unmistakable. Absently, he brushed a lock of violet hair out of his face. He froze. Ichigo tugged the lock of hair back almost violently, the sharp pain indicating that yes, it was indeed growing from his scalp, and yes, it did appear to be both a different length and a different color than he distinctively recalled. He gaped at the few strands that had come loose in his fingers. "Okay," he said slowly. "Can someone tell me what happened?" He was not comforted by the fact that Kisuke and his hind exchanged grim glances, neither speaking for a moment. "What is the last thing you remember?" His father eventually broke the silence. Inu disappearing into reishi particles, Ichigo replied honestly, heart clenching as that scene flashed before his eyes again. Another close friend dead, because he could not reach her in time, because he was not strong enough, because he could not protect her. Another person whom he had failed. "Do you remember what she had said?" Kisuke pressed gently. He should have looked amusing, supine on the table, but Ichigo could not dredge up any laughter at the moment. Ichigo frowned, trying to remember the last few seconds before the darkness fell. Something about wishing Aizen did not win. He guessed. "Close enough," Kisuke allowed. Her exact words were, "I wish this had never happened." But that was not the last thing she said. Ichigo shook his head slowly. "I didn't hear anything else," he trailed off, eyes widening as he remembered something out of place in the deluge of memories dragging him under. "Watashi wa danko toshite kyazut susuru," quoted Ishine quietly. "Is that even possible? We've always taken Inukun's usual koto dama, the phrase she utilizes to invoke her powers, watashi wa kyazut susuru, to mean I reject," Kisuke mused quietly. "But if we take her literally, then what she actually says is, I refuse to accept." "Aizen told us that Orium-chan's powers came from the Hogyaku," Ishine added. "If that was true, if her powers could indeed evolve according to the strength of her desires, I absolutely refuse to accept. Then not even time can stand in her way," finished Ichigo. He took in the shiakusho all three of them were wearing, the lieutenant badge tied to Ishine's arm, and flipped the white haori in his hands over to reveal the kanji for two embossed on it. "That's what happened, isn't it?" Kisuke inclined his head slightly, hampered by his position. "How far back did we go?" "We're not sure yet," Ishine told him. "Yuriuki has gone out to check. Judging from my lieutenant badge and Kisuke's lack of a haori, it's between 1 and 2 centuries. At least a decade over a century. I didn't see the Hogyaku where I've always kept it since its invention," interjected Kisuke. Ichigo's eyes widened. "So Aizen can't have melded with the Hogyaku, because it hasn't been invented yet, so right now he's still mortal and he can die." He swung himself off the table and made to rush off immediately. "I didn't know you were suicidal," Kisuke murmured. His quiet voice stopped Ichigo cold in his tracks. "What? Do you think we hadn't considered it?" Ishine burst out. "Do you really think the Goti 13 will let you get away with the murder of one of their most beloved lieutenants?" "If that's what it takes," Ichigo gritted his teeth. "I'll do it." "Worse, what if you don't succeed in one try and he raises the alarm?" questioned Kisuke reasonably, turning on his side to regard Ichigo. "Are you prepared to go through the entire Goti 13? Ichigo frowned. "Then why won't any of you do it? You are, elite on Mitsukido, surely you can kill Aizen while he's asleep." Ishine was already slowly shaking his head. "We have no idea what kind of customized Kido wards Aizen placed around his quarters. Not to mention, only a few in Siridi will have the skills to break into a lieutenant's quarters. Assassinating Aizen will immediately cast suspicion on Yuriuki-san." "They can't prove it," Ichigo countered stubbornly. "Ichigo, this is not the world you're used to," sighed Ishine. "There is no such thing as innocent until proven guilty. Central 46 already detests Yuriuki. Whether or not they can prove it, they will declare it treason and find some minute excuse, some obscure law to execute her." Ichigo hesitated. He wanted to continue arguing, but what they were saying made a horrifying amount of sense. He had no experience with Siridi's judiciary system, but they had been ready to execute Rukia for giving her Shinigami powers to a human, an offense that ordinarily would never have carried the death penalty. Granted, it had been Aizen who ordered the execution, but the fact that no one even protested, save for Kiraku Shunsui and Yukatake Jushiro, spoke volumes about how routine such verdicts were. However, why do they hate Yuriuki-san? Kisuke and Ishine exchanged another glance. After the Quincy massacre 2 centuries ago, Yuriuki-san had been one of the main voices calling for a complete overhaul of the government, which eventually stripped the Central 46 of most of their executive power, explained Kisuke slowly. He closed his eyes briefly and took several long, deep breaths before continuing. Her position as the head of one of the 5 great noble clans had been instrumental in lending legitimacy and political power to the reform movement. Ichigo winced. If it was just our lives on the line, we might have done it, Kisuke added darkly. Ishine hissed through his teeth. What do you mean? They wouldn't be content to stop at just executing her, growled Ishine. After she's dead, they will take her, humiliate her, drag her name through the mud, and use her to discredit the entire Shihoin clan. Not just the Shihoin, disagreed Kisuke. Every single Shihoin retainer clan, the Feng family, the Omada family, every individual ever fostered by the Shihoin, who has ever married someone carrying the Shihoin name, who has any tenuous association at all with the Shihoin. He trailed off and coughed slightly, waving Ishine off. Ichigo had slowly sank back onto the table in horror as the list went on. How do you know that? He asked weakly. They had sounded just a little too knowledgeable about this subject for it to be pure conjecture, but, dare he imagine it? The 2 older men exchanged dark looks. You should tell him. Ishine exhaled softly and inclined his head slightly. You knew the Shiba clan had been one of the great noble clans, he began quietly. Our blatant disregard for what the Central 46 had considered propriety had won us no favors, and is only made worse by Yoryuki's friendship with our current clan heiress, Kyokaku. Why do you think we suddenly fell out of favor? Ichigo blinked and straightened in dawning horror, nearly falling off the table as a result. Are you telling me? Aizen had made up some perceived unforgivable slight to him on Kaien's part, snarled Ishine. He went to the Central 46, and received their support to declare blood feud on the entire clan. Every man, woman, and child who depends on the clan for their livelihood, who married into the clan, whose only crime was to carry the same clan name, continued Kisuke while Ishine forced himself under control. All but 5 of them, dead in a single night. Why do you think Kyokaku and Ganja hate Aizen so much? Asked Ishine bitterly. After that, they suspected, of course we suspected, that Aizen had murdered Kaien. But we could never get any proof. We cannot move against Aizen, Kisuke emphasized, struggling to rise to make his point, but Ishine forced him down again. Do you understand why, now? Ichigo nodded sharply. So what do? We need evidence that Aizen is a traitor. Insurmountable evidence that he cannot refute. And what kind of evidence would this be? Ichigo jerked his head around at the new but oh so familiar voice. It couldn't be. His eyes widened. You. Good morning, greeted Kisuke placidly. When did you wake up? When Abo started sprouting his harebrained scheme of rushing off to kill Aizen. Gold-flecked eyes flickered over to Ichigo, and Ichigo, for it could be none other than his inner Aaron Carr, even if his appearance had changed enough to be nearly unrecognizable, sniffed haughtily. Ichigo swung his legs over the edge of his own operating table and dropped lightly to the floor. Really, sometimes I wonder whether his head is stuffed with cotton wool. Ichigo shrugged at the insult. Yeah, I suppose I deserved that, he commented reflectively, and scowled when the other 3 exchanged startled looks. I'm 19, I'm not so melodramatic anymore. Not all the time, you mean, cackled Ichigo, padding across the floor. Ichigo made to growl at him, but then paused, realizing he was just proving Ichigo's point. Ichigo does make a good point though, he acknowledged. What evidence are we looking for? And while we're at it, why do we, he gestured to himself, look like this? Using a nearby computer terminal as a reflective surface, Ichigo ran a hand through his pale blue hair, which was still short. Ichigo thought it was distinctively unfair. I look like a cross between Yukatake and Grimjo, he complained, tugging on his fringe and glaring up at it, but only succeeding in looking cross-eyed. Ugh, I look like a Shinigami. At least it isn't pink, Ichigo consoled him while Kisuke and Ishine snickered in the background. They exchanged winces, an image of Sail flashing through their minds. Although they had never met the scientist in person, the pictures Kisuke had obtained from the surveillance cameras in Las Noches, so that was how Aizen had known where they were all the time, were horrifying enough. No wonder Ishida and Renji had shuddered at any mention of his name. Examining his own face in the blank screen of the computer terminal, Ichigo grimaced at the minute adjustments to his facial features, not enough to make a difference individually, but when taken as a whole, he could possibly still pass off as Kurosaki Ichigo, but only if the person making the comparison was drunk. Then again, he vividly recalled an incident where Ishida of all people was mistaken for him, back when they had still attended high school. What part of me resembles Kurosaki? The Quincy had not been amused, and Inu had not helped matters by giggling the entire time. One of the thugs, evidently assuming she was easy prey, really, Now, anyone who hung around a brawl giggling of all things, whatever their physical appearance, should not be underestimated, had grabbed her from the back. Ichigo still winced to think of it. Without blinking, Inu had thrown her elbow backwards, smashing into his solar plexus, kicked his legs out from under him while he wheezed, and then when he was on the ground she stomped on his groin for good measure. Attacking Inu had gotten Tatsuki involved, and as if those delinquents had not already been pathetic enough, they rapidly sank to a new low. Beside him, Ichigo chuckled. Yeah, second strongest girl in Japan, all right. Surfacing from his memories, Ichigo turned expectantly to the other two men. So? The question pertaining to your new appearance is easier to answer, began Kisuke slowly, pausing significantly between sentences but otherwise appearing to be his usual self. Shortly after our arrival, you began convulsing. There were also visible fluctuations in the reishi comprising the outer shell of your soul. He breathed deeply, once, twice. From these and other smaller cues I concluded that your soul was destabilizing because your presence was being rejected, for lack of a better word, by soul society as you did not exist in this time. To counterbalance this, I anchored your soul to the blanks left over from my Jikengan research using a special reishi string. The most terrifying few days of my life, muttered Ishine darkly. Especially when the energy from the combat pill in his system, which he didn't tell us about, ran out halfway and he almost couldn't finish. Days? Squawked Ichigo. Yes, Kisuke answered faintly. I had to modify my designs for the reishi string for this purpose and form it with my own ryotsu, attach it to the blanks, begin transfusing Ryuryoku into them to prepare them. Hence the ryotsu exhaustion, interjected Ishine while Kisuke took a moment. Idiot didn't even tell us that the only reason he had been upright when the shop exploded was because he'd been taking combat pills like candy. Neither of you has the experience to detect and adjust the amount of reishi flow as necessary, countered Kisuke. Nor do we know how to do a Ryuryoku transfusion. Retorted Ishine. You were nearly dead on your feet. If you had fallen unconscious halfway through, we would have lost both you and Ichigo, he continued more quietly. Kisuke's gaze skittered away to the ceiling and he made no reply to that statement. Had worse. The blonde's voice was so faint Ichigo had no idea if he had even meant to say that out loud. You keep saying blanks, as in plural. Remarked Ichigo suddenly, breaking the awkward silence. He glanced down pointedly at himself. Does that mean we have separate bodies now? Ah, yes, Kisuke seized the opening gratefully. One blank could not contain all of Ichigo's Ryuryoku, especially not after you absorbed the remnants of Inukan's shield. It was on the verge of exploding from Ryuryoku overload, so I made the decision to hasten the fracture in your soul and tie each part to a different blank. The stress on your soul, from being essentially forcibly ripped into two pieces, was what had kept you asleep the past few days. Ichigo exchanged a look with his former inner Arankar at Ishine's tone. If that was what it took to keep us alive, then we thank you for it, Kisuke-san. Both of them sketched a deep formal bow of gratitude. Kisuke blinked, a slight flush creeping up the side of his neck, standing out vividly against the pallor of his skin. Gratitude is unnecessary, he murmured the traditional reply. Tactfully, Ichigo dropped the subject. His mother had drilled etiquette into him after all, even if he chose not to use them most of the time. What did you mean by Inu's shield, though? Ichigo had another train of thought. But King could hold our combined Ryuryoku even in his human body. He spat the word human as though it were a disease. Ishine snorted. Human bodies are comprised of relatively more flexible kishi atoms, which is far more amenable to stretch than the more rigid reishi shells are. Not to mention, Ichigo's vast reserves of Ryuryoku developed gradually over his life, which gave his body time to adapt to the increase. Trying to force all your Ryuryoku right now into a blank is like trying to fit an ocean into a teacup. Huh. As for Ichigo's question, Kisuke answered this time, it is likely that upon activating her powers, Inu-kun subconsciously wanted to protect us from the backlash of the time-space distortion. Her wish manifested as a shield that covered us from the rejection. It is not us that was sent back in time, but rather everything else that was reset. When the shield had fulfilled its purpose, it dissolved into reishi particles and was absorbed by the four of us. You can imagine the amount of ryotsu needed to shield us from such a drastic change, Ishine added. It probably took every bit of strength Orium-chan had. She poured her entire being into it, murmured Kisuke thoughtfully. Right now, we are quite literally carrying all her hopes and wishes. A horrible thought struck Ichigo. Does that include the Shunshunrika? He demanded. Kisuke frowned. It should not. The Shunshunrika, like a Zanpakuto spirit, is bonded to her soul. Unless she was using her soul to power the shield, which, now that I think about it, isn't as impossible as I would normally consider it to be." He trailed off, eyes fixed blankly up at the ceiling. For a long moment no one spoke, each immersed in their own thoughts. The door creaked, unnaturally loud in the silence that had ensued, and drew everyone's attention to it. "Did I miss something?" Shiho and Yoriyuki asked, standing at the entrance, blinking. "Kisuk, what are you doing over there?" Convincing Ichigo that I'm not Aizen, the blonde replied absently, eyes refocusing. "Ah, welcome back, Yoriyuki-san." He made to get up. "You stay right there," snapped four voices at the same time. Kisuk blinked, but hurriedly laid back down obediently when Yoriyuki stalked over. "You," she growled, pinning him with an irate glare. "What part of bed rest do you not get?" Kisuk raised his hands as though to physically ward her off. All right, I really do get it." He glanced wildly around the room, gaze pausing on Ishine. Ishine rolled his eyes and came to his rescue. "So, what's the date?" Yoriyuki straightened, all trace of humor disappearing from her voice. "January 28, 1873. Ichigo exchanged a blank look with Ichigo while Ishine frowned. "Did something special happen on this day? Other than being the eve of the Lunar New Year?" asked Yoriyuki rhetorically. Both of them looked expectantly at Kisuk. "Contrary to popular belief," Kisuk retorted drily, "being a genius does not mean I can remember every single day in my entire life." "Wait," Ichigo exclaimed suddenly. 1873, isn't this the year Japan changed to the Gregorian calendar?" He was met with bemused looks from all three Shinigami. "We'll take your word for it, high school graduate," his father informed him. Ichigo scowled. "It's not our fault that we didn't make it to our university entrance exams because we were stuck in Seoul society," grumbled Ichigo. "Between Aizen, the Wandenreich, and the Fullbringers that year, when were we supposed to study?" added Ichigo bitterly. "I probably wouldn't have passed anyway. Even Ishida didn't manage to pass, after all that effort he put into squeezing out just barely enough downtime to take the national examinations. The rest of us just gave up, those days we spent more time fighting than in school." "Still," interrupted Ishine before the duo could delve into a full-blown rant, "I don't think the choice of calendar in the transient world has anything to do with our current situation. Whatever the reason, we now have 2 extra days of holiday to decide what we should do," concluded Kisuk. "I put you on backdated paid leave," Yoriyuki added, almost as an afterthought. Kisuk sighed, almost mournfully. "Sui Feng-san is going to be unbearable." Yoriyuki rolled her eyes. "I'll tell her you're researching a poison for the Onmitsukido. Can you theorize while lying down?" "I could reverse engineer one of that Aaron Carr scientist's most lethal concoctions in theory," mused Kisuk thoughtfully, "but I'll actually have to run some experiments for the final product." "Then one of us will stay with you at all times," instructed Yoriyuki in a tone of finality. Kisuk shot her an askance look, but did not protest further. Yoriyuki huffed slightly, unceremoniously dropping several bags on the nearest empty table. "Lunch," she explained succinctly, an evil smirk spreading across her face. "Oh, does the poor Whittle Kichan need someone to feed him?" Kisuk blanched at the sight of the yakitori skewers being twirled between her fingers. "I can do it myself." He tried weakly. As though he had not spoken, Yoriyuki continued advancing on him. "Open wide," she suggested in a sing-song voice. Eating their own lunch at the side, the 3 Kurosaki members watched the scene with varying expressions of amusement and bemusement. "She's really annoyed at him for overexerting himself," Ishine explained quietly to the 2 teenagers. "This is her being annoyed?" Ichigo whispered back. He shot Yoriyuki, who was cheerfully shoving skewers into Kisuk's mouth, an alarmed look. "She looks like she's trying to stab him to death." "What does she look like when she's downright furious?" wondered Ichigo. Ishine glanced at them. "You've seen her truly angry before," he reminded the other softly. Ichigo's eyes opened wide. "Oh, yes," he murmured. Being caught up in his own battles at the time, he only heard of the circumstances second-hand later. But there was no mistaking that torrent of riot so, normally under such tight control he could barely feel it unless he was next to her. Only his reflexes and sheer speed had saved him from that flying mountain. His opponents had not been so lucky. They had had to redraw the map of Japan after that. Ichigo sighed in appreciation. "They should put up a sign at Ground Zero, 'Here lies the Ishikari Mountains,' which used to exist." He hopped off his seat, setting his chopsticks down. Now I'm itching for a spar." His eyes swept the laboratory and he began to frown. "Where is it?" Ichigo jerked, panic rising up in his chest as he too leapt up. "Where is what?" Ishine asked urgently, rising to his feet a beat slower than them. The duo turned to him. "Our Zanpakuto." From the corner of his eye, Ichigo spied Yoriyuki spinning to face them. "I don't remember seeing Zanjutsu with you," she murmured, almost to herself. "What?" shrieked Ichigo. "Calm down," ordered Kisuk, pushing himself up. He fixed them with a steely gaze. "Try meditating to see if you can find him." Nodding, the two fell into mirroring Jinzen positions on the floor. Ichigo closed his eyes, allowing his breathing to even out and himself to slip sideways, past the boundaries that held him in the real world. He opened his eyes, expecting to see the sideways skyscrapers he had associated with his mindscape. To his astonishment, he found Ichigo standing opposite him instead in a completely foreign landscape. "Aren't we supposed to be two separate individuals now?" Ichigo asked, waving a hand at what was apparently still their shared mindscape, despite the drastic changes it had gone through. Ichigo mulled it over. "Maybe because we're technically one soul and two bodies?" he suggested. "I'll ask Kisuk-san later." The Arrancar conceded the point, falling into step beside his king as they explored their new mindscape. Unlike the sunny blue sky and glass-paneled skyscrapers in their previous inner world, the new world was made up of darker color tones. Looking up, he saw lightning dancing across a sky stained dark crimson, dimly lit by a sun hanging low on the horizon. Dark crimson. The color of blood. Blood spilt on the battlefield. Blood split by allies, when they arrived too late to help. Blood spilled by innocents, murdered by Arrancar who couldn't care less whom they hit. Dark crimson. The color of war. The two of them exchanged meaningful glances. Perhaps it was for the better that their mindscape had changed, it now better reflected their experiences than the cheerful optimism of the previous one exuded. Once a source of comfort, sunny blue skies could now only grate on their nerves. The new mindscape would, at the very least, serve as a stark reminder as to their purpose in Soul Society, to defeat Aizen, before he could destroy all that they stood for again. Turning his gaze downward, Ichigo noticed for the first time that the surface they had been walking on was not simply bare rock as he had assumed. In fact, it had the texture of obsidian, albeit a blue one, but rippled like water with every step they took. Bending down, he touched the surface with one finger. Light seemed to shift around the point of contact, bending sideways and causing different shades of blue to ripple across the ground. Ichigo stood up, intrigued. From the lecture on Zanpakuto, made compulsory for all Shinigami to attend after the Zanpakuto rebellion, even the substitute Shinigami, he understood that the overall design of the mindscape was often shaped by a Shinigami's personality, but the Zanpakuto's abilities often influenced the details. Judging from what he had seen so far, that was some Zanpakuto he had, or was this actually the product of two Zanpakuto, if Ichigo had his own Zanpakuto? How would that work? He was about to ask Ichigo for his opinion when the Arrancar tapped his arm, eyes fixed on a point in the distance. Ichigo spun around, and his breath caught. The bond between a Shinigami and his Zanpakuto surpassed even that between lovers. It was held as common knowledge that the two would know each other anywhere, and would be instinctively drawn to each other even across worlds. Eyes fixed on the two figures approaching, Ichigo almost forgot how to breathe. "So, we finally meet our wielders," murmured the figure to the left, voice low and soothing. Ichigo thought, very briefly, that he sounded like Byakuya and Ulquiorra rolled into one. That was before his heart swelled, nearly tangibly, at the feeling of simply being near his Zanpakuto, part of himself, again. The other figure raised an appendage in a mock salute. "Yo. So how was it?" Kisuk demanded the moment the two of them opened their eyes in the real world. Ichigo shook his head slowly, trying to dislodge the euphoria of meeting his Zanpakuto for the first time, which even now threatened to bubble up and engulf him. "Intense," he answered after a pause. "For some reason, we don't have Zanjutsu anymore. We met our new Zanpakuto spirits." He shook his head again, harder. What was wrong with him? The scientist's gaze sharpened. "We?" he inquired. For some reason, we have a common mindscape," agreed Ichigo. "You too, you are Kansashi," muttered Kisuk to himself. Ishine and Yoriyuki's eyes widened. "Is that even possible?" she demanded. Kisuk tilted his head to the side in place of a shrug. "This is my hypothesis." "What do you mean, twins of one soul?" Ichigo voiced for the both of them. "In Soul Society, twins don't exist," Ishine explained. "In the transient world, conception occurs when sperm meets egg, creating a zygote that develops into a body. Sometimes, there's more than one zygote, and hence more than one body develops at the same time. The creation of the new bodies then induces souls to disappear from soul society, to be reborn in the real world. Ichigo nodded impatiently. I know that. In soul society, only Ryotsu particles exist, Ishine continued. The ground, the buildings, the people, everything is made up of purely Ryotsu particles. Conception in soul society only happens if both partners possess enough Ryotsu together in order to create a new soul. The overall process is the same, but instead of sperms, one party's Ryotsu merges briefly with the others during conception, and under favorable conditions the excess in their conjoined Ryotsu will break off to form a new soul. Yuryuki took over. Most souls from Rokanga don't even have enough Ryotsu to require food, which is an edible form of Ryotsu particles that allows the consumer to replenish Ryotsu levels, much less than conceive. It's why they form families with other residents, and why anyone who wants children will adopt them. In fact, the only difference between nobles and commoners is whether they were born in soul society or the transient world. Even within noble families, conception is uncommon. The clans will be lucky to boast one child per generation in the main house. That's why adoption into the clan is compulsory for all spouses and concubines, on the off chance that a child was possible. Conception will elevate both parties' class statuses above all others. In addition, the head of any noble house could choose to adopt promising individuals to boost the strength of the clan, added Ishine. Conception of one child can only be guaranteed if both parties together possess amounts of Ryotsu equal to that of 2 average Godei 13 Teiko. Besides, the female bearer or the nurturing container must possess or receive Ryotsu transfusions to maintain a Ryotsu level that rivals an average third seats, in order to sustain the baby's growth, finished Yuryuki. Theoretically, if both parties together possess thrice the amount of Ryotsu required for the conception of one child, twins are possible, Kisuke interjected. Ichigo nodded slowly, beginning to understand. Probably only Yamamoto Soteiko, Aizen, Anohana-san, Yukatake-san, Kiraku-san, Ishine, Kenpeke, and he had that much Ryotsu. It was no wonder that twins did not exist. So, summarized Ichigo. We've just done the impossible. Again. Kisuke snorted. I have long given up on the idea of impossible when used in reference to you. But, what happened to Zanjitsu? Wondered Ichigo. He frowned. Why was he not more upset at the loss of his trusty partner for 4 years? Every time he tried to think of the old man, for he would forever associate the Quincy manifestation with Zanjitsu, despite knowing otherwise, his thoughts skittered away. Compared to everything else, it just seemed so trivial. But that feeling made no sense. How could he ever think his bond with Zanjitsu was unimportant? Ichigo glanced at him. I think that's our new Zanpakuto. Ichigo's mouth dropped open as he sought to isolate that foreign feeling, which felt so right despite everything that his brain was screaming at him. I think, Kisuke began heavily. Inukun likely subconsciously used a visual stimulus to guide her protective shield. Not being a Shinigami herself, in those few seconds her mind did not turn to the bond between Wielder and Zanpakuto. You're saying she accidentally rejected my bond with Zanjitsu, Ichigo concluded hollowly. Kisuke winced, eyes involuntarily straying to his Shikomazu lying in a corner, next to Injitsu. His shoulders slumped. Insofar as I can ascertain, yes. For a moment, Ichigo could not speak. Zanjitsu, a part of him ever since he had become a Shinigami, gone just like that. It was like losing an arm or a leg while asleep, and waking up to find a prosthetic in its place. The prosthetic might work just as well or even better than his human limb, but it was still foreign. Or should have been foreign, except for the voices in his head telling him that it was not. Ichigo was watching him with a faint air of puzzlement. Sometimes, King, you're oddly hung up about the strangest things. Ichigo blinked rapidly, suddenly realizing what was so odd about the whole situation. Did I say any of that out loud? You didn't say anything. Ichigo's eyebrows shot up and he turned to stare at Ichigo. Then, Ichigo summarized their thoughts perfectly. How the world do you keep knowing what I was thinking? As one, their gazes snapped expectantly to the resident genius. I would conjecture that this is a side effect of being as tightly bonded as the two of you clearly are. The blonde trailed off, gaze turning inwards. A moment later, he continued, however, if this operates on the same level as typical Ryotsu bonds, it should lessen with distance and practice. Ryotsu bonds? The three adults exchanged looks. Kisuke sighed. Ishine shrugged. Yuryuki spread her hands. I think, given how well you acclimatized to being a Shinigami, this is probably one of the things everyone forgot that you didn't know about. Ichigo nodded slowly. Even after 4 years, there were many gaps in his knowledge, especially regarding the daily lives of Shinigami that everyone else took for granted. On a daily basis, most Shinigami unconsciously leak Ryotsu around them, lectured Kisuk. Hence, Shinigami who spend copious amounts of time around each other usually have minute quantities of each other's Ryotsu. Ichigo frowned. But isn't Ryotsu a form of energy? How does that work? Kisuk hummed thoughtfully. How good are you at quantum mechanics? The two teenagers stared back blankly. You mean, Einstein's theory of general relativity? Ventured Ichigo finally. I was more interested in biology than physics. Kisuk pursed his lips, evidently considering how best to explain it. The theory that particles can exhibit wave-like behavior, rather. Okay. Your Ryotsu is able to operate at the same frequency as the others after prolonged exposure. There are other factors, of course. The individual has to subconsciously accept the potential shift in Ryotsu, but the study of that is more psychological and philosophical than scientific. An awkward silence fell. I did not know that, commented Ishine. You're a doctor, not a scientist, muttered Kisuk testily. Have you never wondered why different people's Ryotsu can emit different colors? Yuryuki made an impatient noise. For the non-science inclined, what Kisuk was trying to say is that we all have unique Ryotsu signatures, and close friends may leave imprints of themselves, so to speak, in each other's Ryotsu. Ichigo nodded rapidly, glad to move on to a topic he could relate to. I knew that. It was the basics of sensing others, though he still had problems unless he concentrated very hard or he was very familiar with the other person. Wait a minute. Is that why I can sense the Ryotsu signatures of my closest friends more easily? Kisuk snapped his fingers. Remember how you just knew something was wrong with Abarai-kun, even though none of us had felt anything? Ichigo blanched at the reminder. Ichigo glared at the blonde but bit out in a cold, clinical tone. We remember. Kisuk winced, but doggedly plowed on. Your Ryotsu was responding to the strong emotions reflected in his, he explained in a rush. Ichigo inclined his head in a single, brief nod. Ichigo raised his head from his hands. So what do these bonds do? Well, Yuryuki started thoughtfully, it can act as a danger alert system, as you've already known. Ichigo transferred his glare to her, but she seemed impervious. Sometimes it allows you to feel their stronger emotions. Orium's empathic ability, for instance, probably stemmed from that. The closest Shinigami may be able to communicate by tuning into each other's Ryotsu. Ichigo's eyes widened. Like, telepathy? He asked. Kisuk snorted, but a glare from both Ishine and Yuryuki silenced him. Not telepathy, Ishine replied. It's like how a telephone works. When you speak into one end, the vibrations are carried along the connection, in this case, the Ryotsu ribbon, to the other person. If you want the scientific details, I'm sure Kisuk's just dying to give you a lecture. So, like how you can make a telephone with 2 paper cups and a string, summarized Ichigo. Ishine's eyes lit up, no doubt remembering the day Karen and Yuzo came home with that topic as a science project. Yes, exactly. Does it have the same limitations? Asked Ichigo. Ishine's brow furrowed. I think so. Usually you would have to be physically near the other person to find their Ryotsu ribbon, and it takes a lot of effort and trust to extend your Ryotsu down the other's ribbon in this manner, which is why it's rarely used. It's a compulsory skill for everyone involved in high-level Onmitsukido missions, interjected Yuryuki. Real-time situation updates and nearly impossible to trace when you master it, if there's someone you trust enough to that degree. Ishine shot her an askance look, but then a grin bloomed over his face. Is that how you and Kisuk could endure all those endless captain meetings? Because you're passing notes? We're not the only ones, she rebutted, hands on her hips and not looking the slightest bit ashamed. I'm quite sure Kiraku and Yuka do it too. Ichigo coughed loudly, interrupting their showdown. So, how do we do it? Do you remember the feeling you get, right before you slip into your inner world? Asked Yuryuki. When you're hovering on the edge, reach out and find the other's Ryotsu ribbon. Extend your Ryotsu down this ribbon, and consciously project your thoughts along that. It should be easier for the two of you, since you're already connected, Kisuk mused. It might even be possible for you two to cover unprecedented distances. Deciding to test it out, Ichigo mentally reached out, seeking the red ribbon that represented Ichigo. Hello? He tried, feeling rather idiotic. He jumped when Ichigo's voice sounded too loud in his mind. Yo. Before he could protest the volume, however, Ichigo could feel Ichigo's unvoiced apology, accompanying a much softer, sorry. Opening his eyes, when had he closed them? Ichigo could not stop the look of awe from crossing his face. Wow, he whispered. Ishine grinned proudly. On his first try, too. He spread his hands wide. My remarkable son is a prodigy. Shut up, goat face. Two voices shrieked in unison. Ichigo stared at Ichigo, who rubbed the back of his head. Ihihi, reflex. Ichigo snorted. Turning into a Shinigami, aren't you? Shut up. Yelped Ichigo, mortification burning down the bond. Ichigo chuckled, deciding to let the other off the hook for once. He refocused just in time to see the three older Shinigami exchange exasperated looks. This won't do, announced Yoriyuki. You can't just space out when you're using a bond to communicate. Not only will that tell everyone what you're doing, in a battle enemies will definitely get under your guard. Ishine twitched suddenly. Ma, he laughed nervously when everyone stared at him. Just a bad experience with that. Ichigo nodded thoughtfully. How do I improve? As one, three voices sounded simultaneously. Practice. Ichigo groaned and slapped his forehead. Why am I not surprised? Practice, insisted Yoriyuki. When you're eating, when you're training, when you're talking to someone else, why, Kisuke and I can hold a conversation about what's for dinner while making a report to the Soteiko. That's because you two have been best friends for way too long, grumbled Ishine good-naturedly. At the mention of the outside world beyond the five of them, Ichigo sobered. So, now that we know where and when we are, what do we do? He looked expectantly at Kisuke. Snapping a familiar white fan open, Ichigo was not even going to ask where that had come from. Kisuke tapped it thoughtfully against his chin. I need more information, he finally repeated, shifting himself into a more comfortable position against the wall he was leaning on. Information-wise, we are at a severe disadvantage right now. I know distressingly little about what Aizen is doing at this stage, and he far too much. We know more than Aizen, don't we? Ichigo pointed out. We have 100 years more information than he does. Not necessarily, cautioned Kisuke. Our very presence may have irrevocably changed the course of the future. Any knowledge we take for granted, especially the further into the future we go, may never come to pass. So what, we wait. Ichigo clarified, looking distinctively unhappy about that prospect. We wait, confirmed Kisuke, eyes hard. But that is no reason to be passive, to sit and do nothing. Argued Ichigo passionately. Sharp gray eyes swept his face. Who said we were doing nothing? Retorted the blonde rhetorically. The important thing is, we need Aizen to slip up before we can make our move. So we're going to make him slip up. A gleeful grin spread across Ichigo's face at the prospect of mayhem. You're proposing we spy on Aizen, Yoriyuki concluded flatly. Kisuke, I know you've considered the risks before suggesting this, but how do you think we can pull this off? We need information, therefore, logically, we will get information, countered Kisuke grimly. We cannot afford to be oblivious to his plans again. The five of them exchanged solemn glances. You're proposing we spy on him. There was no way Aizen would believe them if any of the three established Shinigami decided to join him. It had to be someone new, someone whom he could be deceived into believing was loyal to him, but who will never be fooled by Aizen's mask. Aizen recruited Tsun and Jin straight out of the academy, reminded Ishine. This shows that he prefers outspoken new Shinigami with a lot of potential but has not yet become loyal to Soul Society. Yoriyuki nodded slowly. He used his influence and charisma as the 5th Division's captain to recruit anyone with potential directly from the academy into his ranks. I don't understand, complained Ichigo. How can a psychopathic megalomaniac like Aizen, who only views everyone as tools to be used to further his own path to godhood, pass off as even remotely likable? Kisuke closed his eyes, tilting his head back to the wall until he was facing the ceiling. That's not him, bit out Ishine bitterly. It's Hirako. What? Shinji's worst mistake wasn't giving Aizen the power of a lieutenant, explained Yoriyuki quietly. It was keeping Aizen close enough for long enough for Aizen to learn how to act just like him. Ishine took a deep breath. That natural charisma of a born leader, the kindness, it's not Aizen's. It's Hirako's. You cannot understand, Kisuke said quietly, face still tilted towards the ceiling, how much Shinji hates himself for that. He could imagine, though. Just like how Tsukishima had effortlessly inserted himself into the memories of his closest friends. Replacing their most precious people with himself. stealing their faces and their personalities and turning their most treasured memories into lies. If Tsukishima had worn Ichigo's face for 100 years and committed such atrocities while doing so, and all because Ichigo had let him, Kisuke-san was right. There was no way he could possibly understand. No wonder Shinji utterly despised Aizen. At first, Ichigo had attributed it to helplessness and frustration at being unable to stop his own lieutenant, but now he could see it. Shinji, the unofficial leader of the Visored, did not have seniority or overwhelming combat prowess over the others. However, they instinctively looked to him for orders. He had an ability to draw people in, to make them trust him and follow him. The same ability, evidently, that Aizen had stolen. He clenched his right hand into a fist so tight his knuckles turned white and for a moment, imagined how satisfying it would be to splinter Aizen's smug expression. "You are not the only one who has lost something to him," Yuki stated coldly. "Don't turn it into a grudge match between yourself and Aizen." Su Yifeng's face, eyes closed forever, flashed before his eyes. Ichigo bowed his head at the implied reprimand. "I apologize for my behavior earlier." Kisuke gave a sharp nod, sitting back upright. Untapped potential and political power in an irresistible package. His eyes alighted on Ichigo. "Political power?" asked Ichigo in confusion. "You mean, because we're from the Shiba clan?" Ishine was already shaking his head. "Technically, you'd be just some bastard children in the main family. Aizen has no problems getting hold of nobles. With Kyan as the clan head right now, the line of inheritance goes to Kyukaku first. Unless I challenge him for it, but he's a brilliant clan head, much better than me." "Challenge?" repeated Ichigo. Ishine blinked and laughed ruefully. Inheritance in the great noble clans is all about charisma and power. If the established clan head does not possess Bankai, then any blood-related member of the clan, not adopted members, gets too messy otherwise. Who has achieved Bankai can challenge for the position. It's mostly a ceremonial challenge. If the clan head really does not have Bankai, you automatically get the position." His eyes slid to Yuki, who was engaged in a silent staring contest with Kisuke. "Ichigo," Yuki broke off the stare down to face him, utterly serious. "Would you agree to be adopted by me?" Everything crystallized in Ichigo's mind at that, as if someone had taken him aside and explained everything to him. Aizen would love for such a chance to strike Soul Society where it hurts the most. As the head of one of the 5 great noble houses in Soul Society, Yuki wielded an enormous amount of power. Anyone she adopts would be regarded in the same way as her. To have such a prestigious noble betray Soul Society, Aizen would no doubt deal Soul Society a huge blow. Ichigo had seen the aftermath of Rukia's supposed betrayal, and it was not pretty. "The council has been after me to designate an heir for the past decades," continued the woman, tone still as flat as before. "The Shihoan clan heir, an adopted Rukonga street rat not yet molded to the hierarchy of Soul Society, he would jump at a chance to turn such an individual to his cause. However, he had to be sure, you mean, just until Aizen dies, or for real?" Kisuke raised an eyebrow. "This is an irreversible declaration," he replied drily. "If you achieve Bankai while as a clan heir, then the only way to oust you is a majority vote. You'll find that very few nobles will vote against someone with a Bankai, unless backed by someone with an even more powerful Bankai." He gave Ichigo a meaningful look. However, could he give up his family just like that? Could he give up being a Kurosaki, give up his parents and sisters and even Ichigo? Ichigo made an impatient noise in the back of his throat. "King, no one's asking you to give up your current family. You're just expanding it to include Kisuke-san and Yuki-san as well. Besides, do you really think what name you choose to respond to changes who you really are?" The Arrancar, former Arrancar, was right. Ichigo blinked in surprise. "I'm not smarter than you, King. You just don't use your brain often." Ichigo sniped. On the verge of responding aggressively, Ichigo paused and seriously considered what Ichigo was saying. Ichigo was created as his mirror image in terms of appearance, but all other attributes including intelligence should be the same as his. So, in a way, he was speaking the truth. Taking a deep breath, he let go of his instinctive defensive reaction. "I agree to the adoption," he calmly informed the others. Yuki's face broke into a wide grin. "Excellent," she purred. "Anno, Yuki-san, how are you going to introduce me to the clan?" asked Ichigo nervously. That grin never boded well. He could vividly remember the borderline torture she called training. "Ne-sama," corrected Yuki impishly. About to argue, Ichigo again tried to think things through. The council elders would certainly object to the adoption of a nobody in their eyes. There was no need to antagonize them even further by showing what they would perceive to be blatant disrespect to the current clan head. It was a matter of choosing which battles to fight. Nay-sama, he relented with a sigh. Yuriyuki smiled in approval. She liked the honorifics attached to her name as much as Ichigo did, but she saw the necessity of it. Evidently, Ichigo did too. The teenager was finally starting to utilize his brain. Good. I'm going to bring you home and explain that you caught my eye as a rare prodigy and decided to adopt you as my heir. Prodigy? Ichigo raised an eyebrow. Surely it could not be as simple as that? Why, yes. As far as they know, you're a Rokanga resident with an instinctive grasp of Shunpo, proficiency in Hakuda, rudimentary Zanjutsu abilities and Ryutsu levels on par with a lieutenant. This kind of chance comes once in several lifetimes. Shinigami lifetimes. And Shinigami lived for very, very long. Ah. Ichigo nodded. A word caught his attention however. Lieutenant-level Ryutsu? Yuriyuki grinned evilly. Of course, you don't want to attract too much unwanted attention with abnormal levels, so keep your Ryutsu compressed at all times, any? Ichigo sighed and nodded again. Well, she rubbed his hands gleefully. What shall we call you? Ichigo blinked at that. What's wrong with my name? Didn't you always complain about how people mistake your name for strawberry? Prompted Ashine. Well, yeah, Ichigo started, but I'll always remember that it means one who protects and that it doesn't matter what others mistake it as, because I know that's who I am. Yes, but one who protects isn't really the theme we're going for. Not to mention I, for one, would like a name that doesn't sound like a rip-off. No offense, but King, your imagination is awful. Just look at Khan. A name that defines you, Kisuk murmured. Ichigo flushed slightly. If it's alright, I'd like a name that can be perceived the same way, by changing the kanji of an existing word to mean something totally different. As a memento, stated Yuriyuki. Ichigo nodded silently. So, are we going to pick a word that sounds as stupid as strawberry? Interrupted Ichigo, grinning broadly. Ah, I know. How about Bakabuta? Ichigo twitched. I will not be named, idiot pig. He snarled. He could just see it. Aizen would probably keel over dead from laughing too hard instead of being skewered by Ichigo's Zanpakuto. Alright, how about yakisoba? It's even a type of food. Ichigo continued, seemingly oblivious to Ichigo's growing ire. Fried noodles, repeated Ichigo disbelievingly. Really, is that the best you can come up with? Then, do you want a fruit? What about Ringo? Ichigo suggested happily. Ichigo gritted his teeth. Do I look like an apple to you? Ichigo only cackled in response. I think nobody will ever take him seriously if he's named Apple, interjected Yuriyuki, though she was also grinning broadly. How about a more sensible name? But there are Shinigami with names that can be equally ridiculous. Argued Ichigo, dancing out of Ichigo's reach just in case his king decided to turn violent. Oh yeah? Ichigo retorted. Give me an example then. Like Hiri. Ichigo argued without missing a beat. Her family name's Saragaki, which makes for puns nearly as bad as strawberry does. In case you didn't notice, that's her surname, you dolt. She didn't choose to have a name that's homophonic to monkey brat. Ichigo snapped. Fine. Then what do you say about Hitsugaya Toshiro? Ichigo blinked. I fail to see what's so funny about that. Not by itself, Ichigo concurred, but don't you think it's funny that his name says lion instead of dragon like his Zanpakuto spirit? Male winter lion doesn't describe him at all. Ichigo stared at Ichigo as though he had grown another head. Then what do you want to call him? Male winter dragon? Toriyuro is way too much of a tongue twister to use as a name. Ichigo pouted. I was only going to suggest we rename him Toshiro. If you want to name him White Winter, Baka, your grammar is failing, Ichigo groaned. I know that. But Shirato sounds stupid. Ichigo snapped back. As amusing as it is to hear Hitsugaya Teiko's name dissected, can we get back to topic? Kisuk interrupted, looking as though he wished there was popcorn. Ichigo and Ichigo exchanged sheepish looks. Then. Ren. About to yell angrily at him again, Ichigo stopped and realized that for once it was actually a proper name. It sounds like you're calling Renji but cut yourself off at the last moment. I'll never remember to respond to that name, Ichigo sighed. Right. No name that sounds like that of a friend's, agreed Ichigo. There's always Shizuka, proposed Yuriyuki. Ichigo stared. Isn't that a girl's name? He did not think Yoriyuki would join Ichigo in coming up with stupid names, but then again with her one would never know. Actually, it's a gender-neutral name, commented Ishine neutrally. Ichigo scowled nevertheless. I think Byakuya is feminine enough for both of us. If you don't decide, I'm going to name you Ichiro. Threatened Yoriyuki. Ichigo panicked. I'm trying. But he's not your firstborn son, inserted Ichigo helpfully. He's my heir, smirked Yoriyuki. There isn't much of a difference. Then, Yuri? Ichigo hastily suggested. Ichigo instantly saw red. Are you trying to condemn me to an eternity of yaoi/Yuri jokes? Are you? Maybe? Ichigo grinned cheekily, easily avoiding Ichigo's incensed swipes. As interesting as this discussion is, I don't think continuing it is going to be very helpful, commented Kisuke, although the humor dancing in his eyes belied his words. That's it. Ichigo snapped his fingers. Everyone sent him odd looks. What? Ichigo asked. What Kisuke-san just said? Continuation. It describes our situation perfectly and it can be a male name. I suppose it does sound better than your other suggestions so far, Ichigo mused. And Tsuzuki isn't such a bad name. Then Tsuzuki it is. Announced Yoriyuki cheerfully. Now for the kanji. Everyone groaned. It has to be befitting of a noble, continued Yoriyuki. Anyone can think of any nature-related kanji that can be read as tsu. Wood, Ishine offered immediately. Bamboo, Ichigo added. Plum, murmured Kisuke. There was a pause as everyone tried to figure out how plum could be a syllable in Tsuzuki. Ichigo summed everyone's feelings up in one syllable. Eh? Well, I took the first word from the kanji of plum rain, explained Kisuke. I don't think you can actually read it separately that way, considered Ishine. Kisuke smiled beatifically and fluttered his fan, as if to negate simple things like convention and grammar. But doesn't it make such a nice pun on Ichigo's birthday? July 15th. Plum rain season. Slowly, the rest began to grin. Alright, so we're taking the first syllable from Tsuyu, decided Yoriyuki, just daring someone to argue with her. What about the Zuki part? First thing I can think of is bamboo. Alright, plum and bamboo it is. Ichigo paused. It actually sounds kind of good. To prove that point, he scratched the two words out on paper. They stared at it. It actually did look like a noble's name, if no one stared too hard. Since he was supposedly a Rokanga resident brought in by Yoriyuki, no one would look too hard. No violent objections? Yoriyuki checked just in case. There were none. Then welcome to the clan, Shiho and Tsuzuki. You're up next, Ichigo-kun. The newly dubbed Tsuzuki grinned evilly. Ichigo gulped. Shirayuki him. Called out Tsuzuki immediately. Ichigo spluttered. Did you just call me Snow White? You don't like it? Tsuzuki mock pouted. Of course not. Yelled Ichigo, all composure lost. True, interjected Kisuke, barely holding his composure. He would totally ruin the image of a damsel in distress. Ichigo could not decide between looking thankful at the rescue and looking murderous at the slight, settling for a scowl instead. Whatever. What about just sticking with Shirosaki? Suggested Ishine. Ichigo winced. I refuse to have the word white in my name. I can already see Yuka Teiko bringing me baskets filled with sweets. He shuddered. But that's only because Toshiro shares the last kanji word of his name with Yuka Teiko, objected Tsuzuki. He bounces around calling Toshiro Shiro-chan. Exclaimed Ichigo. I don't think one missing character is going to make much of a difference to him. Besides, he sobered. Shiro was what Aizen had called me. It looks like you're set on the theme of white, observed Ishine neutrally, sidestepping the reminder of the hollow that had indirectly led to Masaka's death. Ichigo tilted his head thoughtfully. It kind of fits me even now, don't you agree? Then, to take the on-reading of white, something starting with Haku? Ishine suggested. Tsuzuki grimaced. That just reminds us of Rukia's Bankai. Kukaki Rukia. One of the few Aizen had made sure to personally kill. They bowed their heads in silence for a while. So, to follow the theme of white but not use the actual color itself, how about Yukato? Offered Yoriyuki eventually. What the hell is a snow peach? Demanded Ichigo, jumping on the chance to get away from depressing topics. Then, Yukato? She persisted. I'm not trying to become a noble. There's no way I'm answering to Snow Rabbit, protested Ichigo. Or we could give you a Spanish name, mused Kisuk. No way. Ichigo yelped. I'm no longer an errand car, remember? Good point, Kisuk conceded. Then the evil glint was back. So if you ever get hollow-fied, can I name the errand car? Ichigo made a noise that sounded oddly like a yelp of terror. Help me, King. Tsuzuki snickered, but complied with the request. Or how about we go with the normal name Yukimaru? There was a sudden silence as everyone ran out of objections. Fine, groused Ichigo. You still need a family name, reminded Ashine. About to open his mouth to reel off a long list of classmates' family names, Tsuzuki was beaten by Ichigo. Yamanos, he stated confidently. Kisuk's sweat dropped. You want to name yourself Horseback? Yukimaru glared. I want a new name that I can call my own, but that doesn't mean I'll forget what I'm doing here. He sobered, gaze turning inward. I recognize that we may have to wait a long time for our chance to kill Aizen, but this doesn't mean I'll ever forget our goal. He looked up fiercely, locking gazes with a startled Tsuzuki. I'll never forget that once a long time ago I was nothing more than your horse, King. Tsuzuki was suddenly reminded of the time there had been a crazy Shinigami on the loose. The difference was that the Shinigami had somehow managed to fuse with his Zanpakuto, hence gaining a more powerful Bankai form than what most could achieve. Renji had been dispatched to the real world to take care of the rogue Shinigami. The annoying pineapple head had dropped in through Tsuzuki's window late one night, and proceeded to make himself at home. Was it because you need my help that you dropped by? In a rare burst of insight, Tsuzuki had asked. Renji had scowled and turned away. It's not like that, he had protested quietly. Then, why? Tsuzuki had pressed. Renji had turned back to face him, cheeks pink. I just dropped by to see your face, he muttered. Tsuzuki chuckled mentally. That was Renji all right, never asking for help out loud even if the redhead himself knew that he needed it. Ichigo could act so much like Renji sometimes. The only difference was that Renji was dead, but Ichigo, Yukimaru, was right there beside him. The mental equivalent of a shove jolted Tsuzuki back to the present. Baka, he managed to retort weakly. We're Kansashi, remember? How will you ever forget who you had been when I'll always be in your head? Yuriyuki smiled. Well then, Shiho Tsuzuki and Yamanos Yukimaru, welcome to Sirei. Yuriyuki-sama. No sooner had Tsuzuki set foot in the Shihoan clan grounds than a blur appeared out of nowhere. Tsuzuki jerked on reflex, staring in wide-eyed fascination at the very alive, and very young Sui Feng throwing herself at Yuriyuki. Laughing, the woman caught the girl, ruffling her black hair affectionately. Sometimes, he wondered if Yuriyuki had ever regretted leaving her protégé behind. Perhaps Yuriyuki had been trying to let Sui Feng step into her own right, out of her shadow, but it did not happen. Leader of the Stealth Corps, captain of the 2nd Division, mastery of Shunpo, the Shunko technique, all it drove Sui Feng to do was to try to fill shoes too large for her. If he did not think about it too hard, he could almost pretend they were two different people, and in a way, they were. The Sui Feng in front of him was not the Sui Feng he knew, and with any luck, would never have to go through the pain and betrayal that would shape her into the woman he knew. But this was good, it meant that he could compartmentalize, and pretend he was not staring at someone whose passing he had mourned. It helped that he had never seen her dead body before it dissolved into reishi particles, only heard about it second-hand. Inevitably, his thoughts turned to those whose bodies he had held, before their bodies scattered into the surroundings. Would he be able to remain as composed as he was right now? Without warning, a whisper of riot so forced Tsuzuki to duck out of the way instinctively as a fist smashed into where his face had been a moment ago. He glanced around wildly, spotting Yuriyuki leaning against a nearby tree. To his surprise, she tilted her head much like a cat might do and gestured him to go ahead. Eyes widening in surprise, he nevertheless did as bidden. Although Sui Feng would grow to become a formidable opponent in the future, right now compared to his skills, honed with death and desperation, she was only an amateur. The next time she blurred out of focus, Tsuzuki grabbed the arm headed his way. To her credit, Sui Feng barely paused, using his hold as leverage to kick out at Tsuzuki's midsection. He casually blocked the hit with his other arm, channeling a slight bit of Ryotsu into it to cushion the blow. His opponent paused, scowling minutely and shooting him a calculating glance. With what was undoubtedly Ryotsu-enhanced strength, she wrenched backwards the arm he had captive, at the same time using the momentum to flip into a one-handed handstand and kicking out both legs at him. Tsuzuki leaned backwards, releasing her arm right before she could pull away. The lack of anchor caused Su Yifeng to overbalance and land in an undignified sprawl on the ground. Tsuzuki bowed properly, as equals to each other, as she clambered back to her feet, cheeks flushed red with embarrassment. Yuriyuki-sama, who is he? The woman smirked. Remember how the council is bugging me to produce an heir? Well, I found one instead. Su Yifeng spluttered all the way into the main clan house. Okarinase, Kaka. Tsuzuki did not miss the narrow-eyed looks he was getting from the various retainers and household staff when they thought he was too busy gawking at the opulent surroundings. Having only been into the Kazumioji manor proper, he had no idea what the family manor of one of the great noble clans looked like on the inside. Clearly, the one who had decorated this one had spared no expense. Rafters crossed high over his head, heavy tapestries glittered beyond entryways, and carvings adorned practically every other pillar they walked past. They probably think you're my new lover. He tripped and nearly fell at the sudden intrusion into his head. Nearby, where they thought him unable to see them, people were shaking their heads. Although he was sure she could see them too, Yuriyuki ignored them all, striding on with all the confidence of someone born into royalty. Alarmed at her sudden words, Tsuzuki dearly wanted to ask her if she was joking, but had no means of replying. He still needed to concentrate very hard to find someone's Ryotsu ribbon, not to mention trying to project a coherent thought down it. There was no way he could do it while walking, like she evidently could. He stared hard at her back, willing her to read his mind. A chuckle was his only response. He scowled. Yuriyuki Dano. As they passed through yet another of the seemingly endless gardens scattered throughout the manor, one of the shoji doors slid open to reveal a burly man with the same dark skin and violet hair as Yuriyuki. Behind them, Su Yifeng made a hissing noise, quickly stifled. Tsuzuki glanced back at her, only to see caution reflected in bright gray eyes. He inclined his head a fraction in acknowledgement and saw her eyes widen in surprise before he turned his attention back to the potential threat. Well met, cousin Katsuo, greeted Yuriyuki placidly. Outwardly, she seemed as unflappable as ever, but Tsuzuki, who knew her too well, caught the way the trapezius muscles in her back tensed ever so slightly. Lower your eyes to the ground. More prepared for it this time, Tsuzuki barely blinked in surprise. While pretending to be obediently focused on the ground, he watched their interactions through lowered lashes, growing more confused by the moment as they exchanged pleasantries so heavily inundated in archaic polite forms of Japanese that he could barely follow the conversation at times. And who may this young man by Yuriyuki Dano's side be? A member of one of the Rokanga districts, who had distinguished himself in the higher arts despite the humbleness of his lowly background, and whose fostering had been provided for in the founding charters of our esteemed clan. Is that so? Katsuo's voice remained bland, but the lines in Yuriyuki's back further drew together. Without warning, the man stepped forwards, away from Yuriyuki, until he was facing Tsuzuki directly. Then, please permit us to be the first to welcome him to our honorable clan. Tsuzuki bowed deeply and licked his lips, trying valiantly to recall all the samurai movies that he had watched in middle school to cobble up a halfway decent reply. This one thanks Shihoin-sama for the patronage, he tried. The man in front of him stiffened in badly schooled surprise. Where, if we may be so bold as to inquire, he murmured, did Yuriyuki Dano discover such an individual schooled in the verses? It appears that the sun has indeed smiled upon our encounter, returned Yuriyuki equally mildly, deflecting the question. For this is but the latest of a truly remarkable list of achievements that our humble selves have been made privy to. Katsuo nodded slowly. We must alert the council as to this joyous occasion at once. We will not presume to trouble, began Yuriyuki, a crack first appearing in her calm facade, only to be interrupted. No, it will be our utmost pleasure. Without waiting for a response, Katsuo hurried away in yet another direction different from the one Yuriyuki had been headed in. Only when his footsteps had faded did Yuriyuki turn around, and let loose a few vicious curses. Yuriyuki-sama! Gasped Su Yifeng. We must hurry, the woman instructed, ignoring her and setting off at a much brisker pace than before. Selecting a room almost at random, Yuriyuki flung the door open and ushered the two of them in. The moment the door slid shut again, she began to speak. That was Shihoin Katsuo, the previous heir of the clan. His name says everything you need to know about him. Has attained Shikai, but not Bankai. His family is still upset that I took the title of clan head instead of him. By challenging, right? Ventured Tsuzuki, and was rewarded by a short, sharp nod. He winced. For someone named, Victorious Man, it had to have been a harsh blow. There is no love lost between us, and by extension you as well. Tsuzuki blinked at that. It didn't seem like that to me. Yoriyuki snorted. We need to tutor you in formal verses and the art of insults once you become the heir. Anyway, she barreled on upon seeing Tsuzuki about to open his mouth. The important thing is that he has gone to alert the council about you. What makes this bad? Asked Tsuzuki. I had hoped to get the papers started and filed before subjecting you to the council. He's ensuring that I have no time to prepare you for their interrogation, no time to get our stories right and to drill some basic etiquette into you. How long do we have? With the amount of clout his family has? Yoriyuki scowled. 3 hours, maximum. Tsuzuki nodded. What can I expect? They're likely to start off by asking for a demonstration of your skills to see if you're befitting of the honor of being fostered, mused Yoriyuki out loud. They may also ask you about the basic history of the Shihoin clan, which I haven't had the time to teach you. Do you happen to remember anything I've told you before? The Shihoin is traditionally in charge of the Onmitsukido, which now has been merged with the 2nd Division, of which you are the captain. Tsuzuki hazarded a guess. Yoriyuki nodded. The role of the Onmitsukido is to collect information, guard the prison, and perform undercover or stealth-based missions. He vaguely remembered Kisuke once mentioning his role as the 3rd seat, and the rest were guessed from ninja movies he had watched as a child. There's also a subdivision that delivers urgent messages, added Yoriyuki, looking pleased. I don't have the time to run through the entire history of the Shihoin clan, so here's a very quick summary. Mentally, she added, school your expression and don't make a sound. The Shihoin clan is the only one of the 5 great noble clans to be founded by a reincarnated instead of a born soul. This man was named Jinmyo, who later became the first captain of the 2nd Division led by Yamamoto Soteiko. Tsuzuki was glad that she had warned him, for he would probably have spluttered out loud suspiciously had she not done so. As it were, his expression of shock went unseen by Sui Feng, who was behind him. Jinmyo? As in, Jinmyo Tenno, the legendary first emperor of Japan? He mentally calculated the rumored dates of his reign, and corroborated that with what he knew of Seoul society. The Godi I-13 was established about 2,000 years ago, right? He was not sure whether to be stunned or awed that the dates matched up. Due to his actions in life, upon his death the Soul King had chosen to bestow upon him the Hagu and the Bugu, the sacred tools of treasure and war. One of these is the Tenshai Hiso, widely considered the most powerful spiritual tool in Seirai. In each generation, the head of the Shihoin is tasked to be the Tenshai Hisoban, the guardian of this powerful artifact and the defender of the realm. She took a moment to let him digest the information. I am the 22nd head of the Shihoin clan, the current Tenshai Hisoban, the head of the 2nd Division and the Onmitsukido. I have many titles, for instance, Sui Feng liked to call me Gundenko Kaka, Yoriyuki pulled a face at that. The girl squeaked at being mentioned. So your rank in the Godi I-13 is called Captain, your rank in the Onmitsukido is called Corps Commander, and your rank in the nobility is called Your Excellency, summarized Tsuzuki. He nodded slowly. I think I can remember that. Your Excellency, though? Did that mean Yoriyuki was the advisor to a king? The only king he could think of was the Soul King. Resolving to ask her about that later, Tsuzuki refocused on the history crash course he was receiving. Amongst the elders, the one you most have to watch out for is Katsuo's father, Seishin. He was the head of the clan before me, and has never quite forgiven me for taking the position from his son. Just be patient and polite, he can't actually do anything with me right there. If they ask you for your life story, improvise and I'll back you up. Okay, Tsuzuki answered out loud, contemplative as he tried to cram everything he had just learned into his head. Closest to the door, Sui Feng suddenly perked up. Yoriyuki-sama, she called. Already? Yoriyuki scowled. They must have pulled out all the stops. She clapped a hand on his shoulder as she jumped to her feet. Right on cue, the door slid open, revealing a young child. She bowed deeply. Yoriyuki-sama, the presence of your foster has been requested at a council meeting. Giving the girl a nod, Yoriyuki swept out of the room, as regal in her sleeveless and backless Onmitsukido uniform as though she were in full formal kimono. So this is the boy, murmured one of the old men lining the seats in the council chamber. In his position facing the entire council, Tsuzuki felt as if he were on trial. It was certainly meant to be daunting for a child fresh out of Rukanga, he supposed, but he had faced down far worse monsters than an assembly of elderly past their prime. It did not mean that he would underestimate them, of course, they had likely been playing the political game several lifetimes longer than he had been alive, but he did not fear for his life. If Yoriyuki-san could face down the entire Central 46, he could face down a council of 16. You speak thus convincingly, but I believe I speak for the others when I say that I would like a live demonstration of these skills, declared one of the men present, seated at a place of honor. Yoriyuki bowed. Certainly, Seishin Dano. At a gesture from Yoriyuki he stepped forwards, determined to do his best. Flare your Ryatsu, she instructed. Remember, only the level of a lieutenant. Obediently, he followed suit, letting a trickle of Ryatsu escape from his tightly compressed reserves. The council members exchanged looks of curiosity and even some of the vehement protesters were looking interested. Tsuzuki had no doubt there were several silent discussions going on about him. We will adjourn to the courtyard for actual combat, decided a tiny old lady with so many wrinkles on her face that Tsuzuki briefly wondered how old she actually was. She looked as if she could have been Yamamoto's age, and for all he knew, she could really be. Sui Feng called Yoriyuki as soon as they had stepped outside. The girl appeared next to her in a whisper of shunpo. What is your wish, Yoriyuki-sama? If I may, introduced Yoriyuki. This is Sui Feng, the current leader of my personal guard. She is an accomplished combatant at the level of a squadron leader in the Onmitsukido. The girl in question blushed at the praise. Tsuzuki watched her avidly. So this was what Sui Feng had been like a century ago? He could not help but wonder what would have happened if Yoriyuki had taken Sui Feng with her the night she left Soul Society. This is your opponent. Hakuda and Ho-Ho only. Begin. It was a demonstration of his ability, not Sui Feng's, and Tsuzuki reacted accordingly. At once, he shot forward, adding just a slight touch of Ryatsu to his steps to turn it into a slow shunpo. Sui Feng blocked his initial barrage of attacks, returning a roundhouse kick. Tsuzuki smoothly kicked into a faster shunpo, blurring and reappearing behind her. Sui Feng's eyes widened at the sudden display of speed, automatically dodging and sending him a Ryatsu-enhanced punch. As before, Tsuzuki grabbed her arm, but this time used her momentum and surprise to toss her in a judo throw over his shoulder. He pinned her to the ground, looking up at Yoriyuki for further guidance. Yoriyuki nodded in approval, so he offered Sui Feng a hand up. His opponent took it, face again blank of emotions. Was that to your satisfaction? Yoriyuki asked the council. They muttered amongst themselves for a while. What is your opinion of his combat ability, daughter of the Feng family? One of them, not Seishin, finally asked. Nanashi-san is more skilled than I, replied Sui Feng, rather stiffly. Several council members seemed to take her assessment at face value, though the majority of them looked at least slightly dubious. It is well known that the girl has Yoriyuki Dano's favor, countered one of them. Tsuzuki barely held back a snort. As if Yoriyuki's approval of someone else meant anything to the girl, who made it her duty to be suspicious of anyone and everyone close to her mentor. Sui Feng's hatred of Yoriyuki's best friend was legendary. Perhaps we should arrange for an independent evaluation then? Suggested Yoriyuki. I approve of that. Tsuzuki's eyes flickered almost unnoticeably to Seishin. It appears that Seishin Dano has someone in mind already, murmured Yoriyuki thoughtfully. I would propose my son, Katsuo. As the previous clan heir, it seems fitting that he is allowed to test your choice for this position. Tsuzuki could barely hold in a sigh this time. Katsuo, of course. Why was he not surprised in the least? However, there was an instant uproar at Seishin's words. Tsuzuki, who was right next to Yoriyuki, could feel the slightest hint of irritation in her tightly controlled Ryatsu. What did he miss? I have only stated my intention to induct him as a foster of the Shihoin clan. There was nothing mentioned about heirship. Seishin steepled his fingers. And yet, this is the first time you have brought such an individual home in 3 centuries, shortly after we the council have begun asking when you will beget an heir. A Nanashi is the heir to our honorable clan. Barked another council member. Incredulous murmurs spread as the idea was discussed. Tsuzuki scowled ever so faintly. From Kurosaki Ichigo to Nameless of Rukanga in just a day. He had never before really grasped the difference between nobles and commoners until now. If this was what Byakuya had to deal with all the time, he could begin to understand the other nobles' attitude now. He felt a surge of sympathy for the man, who had endured this process twice, once for his wife, once for Rukia. For his cherished one to be caustically termed Nanashi, as if her name did not exist just because she was not born a noble, it offended his 21st century morals. Their superiority complex reminded him a little of Aizen, actually. After 4 years, Aizen still only ever called him Ryoka boy or human, refusing to acknowledge him just because he had not been born as a Shinigami. We do accept your proposal, announced Yoriyuki fearlessly, slicing through the cacophony like a knife through butter. Seishin's eyes widened slightly, before his face fell back into its impassive mask. "Very well then," he declared, raising his voice. "Katsuo?" Unlike Sui Feng, when Katsuo appeared not the slightest movement nor sound was detectable. "Yes, Oto-sama? This is your opponent for the position of the next clan heir. As you command, Oto-sama." Without warning, Katsuo vanished from sight, and Tsuzuki barely skidded backwards to avoid the blow aimed at his temple. He grimaced. That would have hurt. It was followed by 3 quick jabs that he twisted out of the way of, trying to put some distance between them. "He's aiming to kill." Tsuzuki froze for a fraction of a second, but it was all Katsuo needed. An open palmed smack to his sternum sent him flying, crashing into one of the pillars, which splintered under the force. Tsuzuki braced his hands on the ground, feeling blood bubble up the back of his throat. He turned his head and weakly spat out a mouthful of blood. Not good, that last blow definitely cracked his sternum and fractured a few ribs. Katsuo had been aiming for his heart. Had he been anyone else, he would have died. As it were, only instinct had saved him. He had redirected enough Ryotsu to just barely counter and redirect most of the force aimed at his heart, at the cost to the rest of his body. Had he been a normal Rukonga civilian, the battle would have been over. Tsuzuki peered up through the bangs shadowing his face, catching Yoriyuki's eye unerringly. She was frowning ever so slightly, but unlike Sui Feng beside her, she looked neither alarmed nor horrified. So, Yoriyuki believed that he still could win. Even as he watched, her eyes flickered downwards in a silent apology. He took a few experimental breaths, pleased when they did not hurt excessively. He could still do this. Everything depended on him defeating the man standing before him. This was something that he understood, more than political battles or tactical plans. This was something that he could do, that he excelled at. He was fighting not only for himself, but for his new brother Yukimaru, for Yoriyuki-san and Kisuke-san, for his father, for Inu, for all his friends in the future. He would not fail them. He would protect them all. Taking a deep breath, Tsuzuki got to his feet. Is that all? To his credit, Katsuo's eyes merely narrowed and he slid back fluidly into a combat stance. Going on the offensive, Tsuzuki shot for the other man at a speed he had not displayed previously, and was rewarded by a small gasp as Katsuo almost did not manage to dodge in time. He swept his right leg to the back of Katsuo's knees, at the same time bringing his hand down in a devastating chop across the other's neck. Katsuo arched his back, smoothly bringing himself into a backwards somersault to avoid both attacks while at the same time kicking out at Tsuzuki's right leg. Not bothered by the attack, Tsuzuki completed both motions, using his hand to deflect Katsuo while his body twisted sideways with the movement of his leg. Testing stage over, they sized each other up, before breaking into a flurry of blows. Remembering Yoriyuki's warning earlier, Tsuzuki deflected or dodged each attack, not letting Katsuo land any hits on his original targets. He was not well versed enough in either martial arts or human anatomy to understand why she had called them killing blows, but even he could see that many of Katsuo's attacks were calculated to inflict crippling damage. Increasing his speed further, he frowned as Katsuo matched him, neither side gaining an overwhelming advantage. They broke apart, each gasping for breath, assessing each other. Tsuzuki was still favoring his ribs, but he knew that Katsuo had at least a fractured leg in addition to a growing collection of bruises. Drawing back slightly, Katsuo's eyes narrowed and he leapt forwards suddenly, at what was likely near his top speed. Wary, Tsuzuki settled into a defensive stance. In the middle of his charge, Katsuo unsheathed the sword strapped to his leg. No, not a sword, it was too short. This was either a Kowakizushi or a long tanto. The straight blade suggested a tanto, although Tsuzuki did not know enough about weapons to be sure. He would have to rectify that. From the fleeting look across Yoriyuki's face, he was prepared to bet that this was Katsuo's Zanpakuto and not just a normal dagger. Then there was no think, because Katsuo was on him, and had the other man been so fast earlier? Tsuzuki dropped the block he had put up by habit, leaping backwards to give himself more space to maneuver away from the tanto. He was not going to test the strength of his resolve against that, not with the determination gleaming in Katsuo's eyes, and especially not when he had to consciously dampen his output to a minimum. A few strands of indigo floating past his vision told him that he was not fast enough. Tsuzuki resisted the urge to watch them fall. Thanks for the haircut, he told the other impishly. Katsuo growled, ever so faintly, his aloof mask crumbling at the edges. However, Tsuzuki was at a disadvantage, and both of them knew it. The Zanpakuto gave Katsuo extra reach, something Tsuzuki could not counter barehanded unless he was vastly faster than Katsuo. After watching Katsuo move, he would not bet his life on that. Tsuzuki ducked under a swing, and swerved hastily sideways as Katsuo smoothly transited from a slash aimed at chest level into one downwards. He was as good a swordsman as he had been a Hakuta combatant, definitely worthy of the title of clan heir. What would he give to have a weapon with him right now? Only his finely tuned senses warned him of an incoming object aimed for his head, and he snatched the wooden bukin out of midair. "This was his weapon when I found him," announced Yoriyuki amidst the fresh outbreak of muttering. Tsuzuki tried to school his face from showing his surprise. Where did she even get that wooden training sword from? Then his gaze skittered past her, onto the scowling Sui Feng, and then to the blonde who had somehow appeared beside them while he was concentrating on Katsuo. Damn that man for thinking of everything. Katsuo eyed the slim piece of wood, one eyebrow raised. Tsuzuki hefted it experimentally in his right hand. It was just the right weight for Tensou Zanjutsu too. Definitely Kisuke's work. Only the Getabashi would have the inclination and the audacity to weigh his bankai. Just the feel of a sword in his hand settled his frazzled nerves. Tsuzuki settled into a basic stance that he had developed for Tensou Zanjutsu, senses at full alert. Metal screeched off wood, Tsuzuki having switched to a two-handed block at the last moment, legs spread for better balance, one hand braced against the wooden blade to catch Katsuo's swing. Katsuo's eyebrows shot up. Tsuzuki smirked in a clear challenge. The other man did not disappoint, blurring into motion so fast Tsuzuki had to rely on his burgeoning Ryutsu senses to keep a lock on the other man, receiving a few shallow nicks on his limbs for his trouble. Like fighting Jin during the fake Karakura town battles, he was slowly getting used to Katsuo's timing and habits. Swaying out of the way of an upward swing, Tsuzuki swung his own bukin upwards, locking their blades and forcing them away from their bodies. His left hand snaked towards Katsuo's sternum in a blow that should incapacitate the other man. Not a trace of apprehension in his features, Katsuo tossed his tanto in a high arc over his head. Tsuzuki almost did not react in time as Katsuo's other hand came up, lightning fast, caught the tanto by the hilt without even looking and scored a deep gouge across his clavicle. The blade bit into bone, caught for a moment, and then pulled free. He's ambidextrous. To his surprise, Katsuo drew back without pressing his advantage, eyeing the slash in his shoulder with deep interest. Too late, Tsuzuki realized that he had instinctively concentrated his Ryutsu to the wound, stifling the flow of blood to a trickle and turning the debilitating injury into a non-critical one. It was a technique that Anohana Teiko had taught them before they had set off to challenge Aizen in Hueco Mundo, something that could mean the difference between life and death if done right. After all these years, it was already second nature. Katsuo's contemplative look transferred to his own Zanpakuto, glistening red with blood. Tsuzuki could almost hear the gears in his brain turning. If even taking him by complete surprise in close quarters did not work, then Katsuo grinned, ever so faintly. Tsuzuki had perhaps half a second to feel truly alarmed when Katsuo spoke for the first time in their battle. Kiro, Kaiso. Half incredulous, half stunned, Tsuzuki took the first few moments just to observe. The single long tanto turned into a pair of shorter tanto, each with the same diamond shapes decorating its hilt. What was more perturbing was that each tanto was double-edged unlike a regular sword or knife, and on top of that the blade tapered to a point at the tip. The small daggers did not look very impressive to most Shinigami, perhaps, but Tsuzuki was no novice who measured power by size. If the release command had meant anything, the deceptively thin blades would slice his bukin in two if he tried to use it to block. Katsuo spun one and then the other idly, shifting both of them into a reverse grip. Tsuzuki's eyes flickered over the confident way he held them, seeing a surety born from decades of experience and not false bravado. Despite the unconventional style, this was no amateur he was facing. In the span of a single blink, Katsuo was gone. Tsuzuki threw himself backwards with a Ryutsu-enhanced jump, and not a moment too soon, for Katsuo appeared in his previous position, daggers poised to stab through his abdomen. He finally understood what to be Shihoin fast meant. And to think, he had thought it was a term coined for Yoriyuki-san alone. Tsuzuki growled low in his throat. To hell with her directive, if he continued displaying the skills of a mere lieutenant he was going to get killed. The next time Katsuo charged, Tsuzuki vanished with a loud crack. Katsuo halted a fraction of a second before spinning abruptly around, raising his daggers in a cross guard. Tsuzuki appeared above Katsuo, gathered his Ryutsu and shouted a kie. There was no room for error, no doubt in his steely resolve. There was the sound of metal upon metal. Using their locked blades as leverage and the momentum from his jump, Tsuzuki delivered a powerful knee drop directly into Katsuo's solar plexus. The other man choked, loosening his grip on his daggers at the Ryotsu enhanced blow to his unprotected stomach, and staggered backwards. Pressing forwards, Tsuzuki swept both his legs out from under him with a vicious kick and brought his own sword smashing down with another loud cry. The bukin buried itself a few inches into solid rock, so close to Katsuo's face that he briefly went cross-eyed staring at it. The silence was deafening. Tsuzuki leaned heavily on the bukin, gasping for breath. Now that the adrenaline rush was receding, his injuries were clamoring to make themselves known in a most painful manner. He gingerly laid a hand on his ribs, where Katsuo had landed his first blow, and tried to ease the small jolts of pain each breath caused. Surely Sishindano has no further objections? There was an even longer pause this time, long enough for Katsuo to slowly get to his feet, his Zanpakuto held loosely in one hand. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the bukin. Tsuzuki eyed him, and then nodded. Just in case, he edged into a semi-defensive stance. Katsuo yanked the bukin out of the ground with one hand and gave it an experimental swing. Then, without warning, he brought his Shikai daggers down on the blade. The wood splintered cleanly with a sharp crack, the unsupported end clattering to the ground. Picking the dropped end up, Katsuo inspected the cut edges carefully. Frowning slightly, he then proceeded to snap one half of the bukin into another further two pieces, ignoring Tsuzuki's outraged protests. Then Katsuo looked up and met Tsuzuki's eyes for the first time outside their battle. The former clan heir shrugged almost ruefully, flipped one of his daggers into the air and caught it with the other, letting them melt back into their sealed form and sheathing it back in his thigh holster with a practiced motion. "I concede," he told the council clearly. No one seemed to know how quite to respond to this declaration, least of all Sishin. Finally, an elder woman spoke up. "What about his skills at Kido?" Tsuzuki frowned. Was she kidding? How could a Rokanga civilian know anything about Kido? He nearly missed the shadow of a smirk on Yoriyuki's face. "Imitate this," Yoriyuki informed him, and Tsuzuki could not help but stare. She could not really be testing his Kido skills, could she? "Gather Ryotsu into your hand, and repeat after me." Apparently, she could. Kunrin Shayo. Kinako no Kamen, Bansho, Habatake, Hito no Nao Kansuma no Yo. Shonetsu Soren, Bamihidate Sakamaki Minami Itaho o Susumyo. Heido no Sunjuichi, Shakaho. He cried, doing his best to limit the level of Ryotsu gathered in his palm and to keep it from fluctuating. He was so close, he had no idea what Yoriyuki was thinking, but if she wanted him to demonstrate Kido there was obviously a very good reason for it, and he was going to do his damned best not to fail her. Yoriyuki's orb of crimson energy punched a perfectly round hole in the far wall, whereas his blasted off a jagged chunk of wood. Tsuzuki winced. At least it was in the direction he aimed in and the damage was mostly contained. "You say he is uninstructed in the ways of the Shinigami?" clarified another council member, leaning forward to scrutinize him. "Yes. He is simply a very fast learner and able to adapt quickly," she explained. Tsuzuki gaped, barely remembering to ensure his mouth did not drop open in shock. The conniving cat. Instead of declaring that he knew nothing of Kido, which everyone present was obviously already aware of, she turned it to his advantage by allowing them to witness what was, to their knowledge, his first attempt at Aikido and to see firsthand his ability to pick up new things. The council muttered amongst themselves for a while, but it was clear that there was nothing that could be criticized about his combat abilities. "Who taught you how to fight?" A child of the 21st century, he knew the trick to surviving an interrogation with those who made it their jobs to detect falsehoods. "Speak only the truth, but not the full truth." Tsuzuki grinned, and replied honestly, "A candy store owner." Yoriyuki choked. Undeterred, Sishin merely narrowed his eyes and continued the inquisition. What was this individual's name? He called himself a humble shopkeeper, deflected Tsuzuki. He fancied he could hear Kisuk's echoing peals of laughter, despite the fact that the blonde outwardly had maintained an impressive poker face. Earlier that day. Yoriyuki-sama. Yoriyuki grinned as she ruffled her little bee's hair. Sui Feng pouted a little, but they both knew it was a token protest. The girl smiled up at her mentor, sending little jolts of pain through Yoriyuki's heart as her image overlapped with that of her older self, no less eager to please. And then, inevitably, those eyes caught sight of Tsuzuki. Yoriyuki heaved a small sigh as Sui Feng's eyes narrowed, letting go of her. "Who are you?" she demanded, scowling. Without waiting for an answer, she turned to Yoriyuki. "What is he doing here?" Tsuzuki did not respond for a moment, gaze turned inwards. Yoriyuki barely resisted the urge to whack him upside the head. The youth really needed to learn to stop with the introspection in public, it could get him attacked someday, like now. Without warning, Sui Feng, who had been glaring at him for daring to ignore her question, vanished with a whisper of Ryotsu. Leaning against a tree, Yoriyuki only smiled and tilted her head in tacit permission when Tsuzuki looked towards her as skidded backwards to avoid another punch. Best to get him on Sui Feng's good side as soon as possible, she had a feeling that he would need it soon. Especially if... Her gaze darkened as she spotted several telltale shadows abruptly wink out of existence in her peripheral vision. Seishin should really train them properly. Did they not know that peripheral vision was best for detecting movement? She conveniently ignored the little voice at the back of her head that sounded far too much like Kisuk telling her that a cat's peripheral field of vision was larger than a human's, so it probably was not their fault per se. Yoriyuki-sama, who is he? Yoriyuki smirked. Remember how the council is bugging me to produce an heir? Well, I found one instead. Striding into the Shihoin manor, Yoriyuki ignored with practice the whispers that Tsuzuki drew from behind their backs. The perks of preternatural hearing meant that unlike the youth, she could hear the uncomplimentary things they were muttering under their breaths. Clearly, they were not working hard enough if they had the time to stand around and gossip about her sex life of all things. She raised an eyebrow upon hearing a particularly imaginative tale involving her, Kisuk and Tsuzuki in a love polygon rivaling that in a soap opera. Really now, perhaps she should recommend him for a post at CRIDI Communications, his time might be better spent there. Just to tease the youth, she dropped a hint of the idea in Tsuzuki's head. It was so amusing to watch him trip over nothing, cheeks flushing a flaming red, that she could not help chuckling. The youth was still too fun to tease sometimes. Her ears twitched at a barely perceptible sound and she sobered immediately. Lower your eyes to the ground. She noted with approval that Tsuzuki followed suit without a single protest. Good. If nothing else, maturity in a war had taught him to defer to others' judgment in emergencies, and this certainly qualified as one. Well met, cousin Katsuo, Yoriyuki greeted. Who knew how many scouts you had sent out before you arranged for this little, accidental meeting? Katsuo smiled genially back. Upon receiving word of our honorable head's return, we hastened to greet her. You were not the slightest bit discreet in your little display, cousin. Yoriyuki sniffed slightly. Still as pretentious as ever, carelessly wielding the royal we as if it were his birthright. They fenced a little while more with pleasantries veiled in insults, before Katsuo broached the reason for his approach. And who may this young man by Yoriyuki Dano's side be? His tone contained the barest hint of derision. No doubt he too had heard the same rumors as she had on his way over. A member of one of the Rokanga districts. Who had distinguished himself in the higher arts despite the humbleness of his lowly background. And whose fostering had been provided for in the founding charters of our esteemed clan, returned Yoriyuki in a saccharine tone, subtly reminding Katsuo of the Shihoin tradition to foster talented Rokanga civilians, a tradition that she was well within her right as clan head to follow. Is that so? Katsuo's tone turned haughty for the briefest moment, and he spoke directly to Tsuzuki before she could formulate a reply. This one thanks Shihoin-sama for the patronage. Yoriyuki's eyebrows shot up, and Katsuo stiffened in surprise so obvious that even Tsuzuki should be able to pick up on it. So, clearly Tsuzuki had been taught the formal verses somewhere, though she could not figure out where in modern Japan he could have learned such a thing. It was a pleasant surprise, she had been half expecting to have to teach him from scratch. Although he was a little off, this one was not a term she would have chosen personally had she been in his shoes. For a supposedly uneducated Rokanga civilian, Tsuzuki was showing remarkable amounts of depth. It appears that the sun has indeed smiled upon our encounter, she could not help but needle Katsuo again. And then Katsuo agreed with her. Yoriyuki only had a moment to panic before he launched his own attack, evidently having gathered his wits about him. On some level, she was so very proud that Tsuzuki could evoke such a reaction in him. Katsuo was clearly troubled by this, Rokanga civilian, enough to activate his trump card. She watched his swiftly retreating back, her face frozen in its practiced mask of geniality. Either he had put too much stock in those rumors, or, far more likely, in his haste Katsuo forgot that she had a trump card left. Kisuk? I think I have a little problem. She revised her opinion of the youth. Just enough to follow the literal meaning of their conversation, but completely missing the subtext, carried in the subtle inflections of tone and barest flickers in choice vocabulary. Never mind, he could learn. If he was given the time to learn. Yoriyuki glanced at the silent Sui Feng in the corner nearest the door and launched into an abbreviated history lesson, keeping her references vague. I would propose my son, Katsuo. As the previous clan heir, it seems fitting that he is allowed to test your choice for this position. Yoriyuki bit the inside of her cheek harshly, not letting a trace of irritation show on her face. Breathe. He's testing you. I have only stated my intention to induct him as a foster of the Shihoin clan. There was nothing mentioned about heirship, she announced out loud, at the same time transcribing the conversation word for word down the line of communication that she had established with Kisuk shortly after the meeting began. At the same time transcribing the There was nothing mentioned about heirship, she announced out loud, at the same time transcribing the conversation word for word down the line of communication that she had established with Kisuk shortly after the meeting began. And yet, this is the first time you have brought such an individual home in 3 centuries, shortly after we the council have begun asking when you will be get an heir. Her Ryotsu twitched ever so slightly at the jab at Kisuk and Tessai, and again when they started discussing Tsuzuki loudly as if he were not in front of them. She could only hope the youth could hold his notorious temper for a while longer. Ripping into the sanctimonious Ignora Muses, as much as she would have enjoyed seeing it, needed to wait after he was formally recognized as the clan heir. We do accept your proposal. Sensing that he was on the brink, Yoriyuki hastily silenced the council with the only words that she knew would. Seishin's eyes narrowed and she knew what he was thinking. A Rokanga civilian in a spar with Shihoin Katsuo, the current corps commander of the executive militia branch of the Onmitsukido? Katsuo? Yes, Oto-sama? This is your opponent for the position of the next clan heir. Halfway through her transmission, Yoriyuki loosed a startled curse as the words registered. So this was what they were after, she muttered grimly. If Katsuo could not be the clan head, he could be her clan heir, all this phrased in a challenge that she could not back down from, now that she had declared Tsuzuki her champion. Seishin had clearly planned this. Kisuk was silent for a long while. Monitor the situation. The battle commenced, and Yoriyuki became increasingly alarmed as Tsuzuki went on the defensive, as he was wont to do, to observe the movements of a new enemy before he began his counter-attack. He seemed completely unaware that Katsuo was not testing him, like his regular enemies usually did. Those were not sparring techniques, the first blow to the temple was aimed directly where one of the main arteries to the brain lay, and each further jab was to a major pressure point. A single hit would mean the end. She had to warn him. He's aiming to kill. And then Tsuzuki froze, so slightly that it was likely most of the council did not even pick up on it, but not someone as honed in combat as Katsuo was. Sui Feng's Ryotsu rippled in slight distress as an open palmed smack meant to crush the heart sent Tsuzuki flying directly into a pillar. Shadowed brown eyes glanced up, directly at her, their owner remaining still for a moment. Yoriyuki lowered her eyes in a silent apology. There was no time for anything more elaborate, for Tsuzuki was already getting to his feet, determination glittering in his Ryotsu. Katsuo narrowed his eyes and settled into his favorite offensive combat stance. Like the rest of the corps commanders, Katsuo had been extensively trained in anatomical knowledge. Unlike most of them, however, his fighting style aimed more to cripple rather than disable, pinpointing the exact locations on his opponent that would allow him to inflict maximal damage. Tsuzuki, on the other hand, tended to subconsciously pull his blows before they became fatal or aim for non-vital areas. Katsuo turned his dodge into a backflip to avoid both of Tsuzuki's attacks, using his nearer leg to kick out at Tsuzuki's outstretched leg in a move that would dislocate the youth's hip should it connect. Bouncing on the balls of his feet, Tsuzuki met Katsuo head-on, deflecting or dodging the other man's blows such that none of them hit their original targets. Yoriyuki was reluctantly impressed. It looked like all it took for Tsuzuki to really get going was knowing that his life was on the line. Perhaps the youth himself was too inexperienced to see it, but Yoriyuki noted that Tsuzuki's eclectic Hakuda style, which refined street brawl with dojo-learned karate, threw the formally trained Katsuo for a loop. There was no learned counter to a style that departed so far from the common schools of martial arts, only instinct. Katsuo was doing an admirable job of learning on the fly, but now and then a hit would come from a totally unexpected direction and take him completely by surprise. Then Katsuo leapt forwards, drawing his tanto in a classic Iaido move that would take Tsuzuki's head off if it connected. Yoriyuki watched the armed Katsuo press his advantage with the unarmed Tsuzuki with no small amount of trepidation. They were already nearly evenly matched in Hakuda. To add a weapon into the mix tipped the balance vastly in Katsuo's favor. A very familiar Ryotsu winked into existence beside her. "My apologies for the interruption," Kisuk murmured pleasantly. "Here is the item that Yoriyuki-san had requested." Without another word, he lobbed the slim piece of wood in his hands at Tsuzuki's head. Yoriyuki held back both a bark of exasperated laughter and an incredulous sigh as Tsuzuki reached back and caught the bukin with one hand, without even looking at it. That was Kisuke all right, always doing his own thing with no regard to anyone else. She had long learned it was best to just give him free rein, and follow at a safe distance to pick up the pieces left in the wake of his destruction. Do you even know the meaning of bed rest? It was a rhetorical question, they both knew, and Kisuke did not bother giving a verbal reply. Tsuzuki fluidly settled into his standard offensive stance for Tensou Zanjutsu, built for speed and agility. She could almost see several of the council members taking note, and mentally grinned. Another point in his favor. Katsuo's tentative first slash was blocked confidently, the youth having transited smoothly into the two-handed block that he favored with his old oversized shikai. A hint of uncertainty flitted across Katsuo's face. Tsuzuki's self-assurance poured off him in waves, solidifying in the bukin in his hands. There was not a single idle thought, not a shadow of doubt that the wood could withstand metal. Only the fierce determination to win burned in his ryutsu. In that moment, she was so proud of him that it hurt. Kiro, Kaiso. Yuriyuki twitched before she could stop herself. Tsuzuki had really rattled Katsuo. She had known Katsuo was ambidextrous, but as any good Shinigami did, he preferred to conceal the majority of his abilities. For him to actually bust out all his trumps in what was meant to be a mere spar, she wondered what Seishin had threatened him with should he actually lose. The Tonto, originally the length of a Ko Wakaizushi, melted seamlessly into its Shikai form, a pair of Moroha. A very rare type of double-edged dagger with the tip tapering to a point, it could be used to slash in either direction or stab. The additional Shinaji in the middle, running to the point, offered the blades extra strength, allowing him to block with them if necessary. And with Katsuo's preferred style, yes, he was transferring them both to a reverse grip now. He really was serious, these were deadly weapons. Katsuo leapt forwards with blinding speed, Moroha poised to stab through Tsuzuki's abdomen in a standard assassination technique. Only amateurs aimed for the chest, the rib cage protected the internal organs effectively against blades, and was vulnerable only to blunt trauma. No, to kill someone with a sharp object, a professional knew to aim for the stomach and twist the dagger up, letting the blade rip through the paper-thin diaphragm and directly into the heart from below. Tsuzuki hesitated, as though contemplating a course of action. She could almost see the moment he decided to throw all caution to the wind. The next time Katsuo charged forwards, Tsuzuki responded with a shunpo so fast that at close range he must have seemed to have disappeared. Only her eyes, long used to tracking motion at the kind of speed that he was displaying, caught his movements as his momentum carried him behind Katsuo to evade the other's field of vision. At least someone knew to stay out of peripheral vision, performed a sidestep to twist his body back around, and leapt. To his credit, Katsuo actually reacted in time. A few spars with her, who was even faster, could do that to a person's reflexes, she supposed. Tsuzuki's ryutsu glinted as he loosed a kie, shattering the silence, and brought his bukin down without a shred of hesitation upon Katsuo's crossed daggers. Metal clashed against metal. Katsuo's ryutsu flared in utter shock for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. In a complete role reversal from before, Tsuzuki slammed his knee directly into Katsuo's coeliac plexus. The involuntary reaction Katsuo's stomach gave and the pain radiating across all the nerves caused his grip to loosen, just a little, and sent him off balance. It was over. Not an amateur himself, Tsuzuki wasted no time in capitalizing on the moment of weakness, kicking both of Katsuo's legs out from under him and with another war cry brought his bukin down into the solid rock beneath them. It sank through like a diamond through glass, quivering in front of Katsuo's wide eyes. That last blow would have killed Katsuo, and everyone present knew that. The fight draining out of him, Tsuzuki kept one hand resting heavily on the bukin buried into the ground, his other hand coming to ghost over his ribs. Slowly, he straightened as his ryutsu resettled itself around him. Surely Seishin Dano has no further objections? Yuriyuki had to ask. Both Tsuzuki and Katsuo would require medical attention fairly soon, now that adrenaline was no longer holding either of them together. The sooner they could end this council meeting, the better. The lack of response made her despair, just a little. To her surprise, Katsuo actually asked, and then waited for permission to be granted before reaching for Tsuzuki's bukin. His ryutsu flickered very slightly when Tsuzuki slid back into a defensive stance the moment he got up. It was too brief for her to pick up on a definite emotion, but there was no aggression in it. To be on the safe side, she shifted her weight subtly onto her dominant leg, measuring the distance between her and Tsuzuki with a practiced eye. Should Katsuo try anything, she would be poised to interfere, as was her right, now that the battle was rather decisively finished. Even Seishin would be hard-pressed to declare it inconclusive just because Katsuo did not declare his defeat aloud. Katsuo peered at the slim piece of wood in his hands, tested its weight, and sliced it into two with a single swing. He squinted at the cut edges, and then broke one of the pieces into two using his bare hands alone. Unseen, Yoriyuki smirked inwardly. Let him examine it to his satisfaction. He would find no trick nor treachery, for it really was just a piece of wood, carved and polished until it was the exact replica of Tensou Zanjutsu. Everything else, the shocking durability, the strength, even the sound of metal, that was the result of Tsuzuki's resolve pulsing through this semblance of his trusted partner, conferring upon it the properties of an actual sword. I concede. Seishin's face spasmed as though he had eaten a particularly sour lemon. Who taught you to fight? Tsuzuki's gaze did not waver, but there was the hint of a sparkle in his ryotsu as he answered guilelessly, a candy store owner. Yoriyuki choked, the rest of her response hastily channeled inwards through Kisuke's ryotsu ribbon before any of it showed in her demeanor. Remarkable, sighed Kisuke in breathless appreciation. What was this individual's name? He called himself a humble shopkeeper. Kisuke's ryotsu fluttered as he barely got his laughter under control. I'm flattered that he remembered. I almost pity Seishin, commented Yoriyuki as they watched Tsuzuki flow around their questions with half-truths coated in a deceptive mildness. If only the 15-year-old teenager could see himself now, all wide-eyed and practically oozing innocence, the complete opposite of the cool image that he had tried so hard to portray. Tsuzuki had really grown up. When did you first meet Yoriyuki Dano? She came across me training one day not long ago. Time was relative, of course, and 4 years was but the blink of an eye to a Shinigami. Where did this occur? It was somewhere filled with a lot of barren rock, mostly cliffs. She could see most of the council members mentally going over their maps of Rukanga, eventually settling on one of the remote mountainous districts. Last question, decided one of the council members. She steepled her fingers and leaned forwards. Are you the secret love child of Yoriyuki Dano and Urahara-san? Tsuzuki turned very incredulous eyes on the speaker. No. Not that he is aware of, corrected Seishin in an unconvinced tone. Yoriyuki stared. When, she asked in utter disbelief, would this have happened? There had been many long-term missions in Yoriyuki Dano's youth, some of which extended for decades, countered Seishin calmly. And we all know the indiscretions of youth. His gaze flickered briefly over his own son and Tsuzuki before coming to rest on her. Yoriyuki bristled, rage bubbling up within her at the mention of those missions. Be that as it may, interjected Kisuke smoothly, speaking aloud for the first time since his entrance. This youth is barely a few decades younger than Yoriyuki-san. It would be impossible for any child of hers to reach such a physical age. She gritted her teeth and calmed herself at the warning reflected in his eyes. Improbable, not impossible, rebutted Seishin. There have been recorded exceptions in history of souls experiencing unprecedented growth rates. The blonde barely blinked. These same records also state extreme environmental stress as the chief driving force for this phenomenon. On what grounds, Yoriyuki zinged back mildly, before Seishin could formulate another argument, is Seishin Dano basing these accusations? Seishin opened his mouth, then visibly took a deep breath and released it. Merely the disquiet of an old man, who feared for the honor of our esteemed head, he replied distantly. Yoriyuki bowed formally. Please rest assured that no such indiscretion has been committed, she uttered in a tone of finality. It appears that all is in order, Yoriyuki's great-aunt and the preceding member of the council, finally spoke. The tiny old woman fixed her gaze upon Tsuzuki. What is your name, child? This one is known as Tsuzuki, Shihoin-sama. She inclined her head in a regal nod. Then we welcome you to our esteemed clan as its incumbent heir, Shihoin Tsuzuki. Yoriyuki beamed in approval as Tsuzuki threw himself into a formal 90-degree bow. Thank you very much, Shihoin-sama. He gasped out, sounding oddly like his friend, that Kukaki girl, whenever she spoke to an authority. She waited until all the council members had filed out slowly, until she could no longer hear nor sense anyone near the courtyard before speaking. Kisuke, sit down before you fall over. Tsuzuki gave a very visible start as his gaze shot to the blonde, who gave her a very resigned look. I can't, I won't be able to get up again, he replied very frankly. Yoriyuki turned her gaze deliberately onto Sui Feng, who squeaked upon becoming the center of attention. Kisuke gave a half shrug. Her opinion of me cannot get any lower than it already is. Yoriyuki frowned, considering the distance from the courtyard in which they were situated to the residential buildings and weighing their chances. Sui Feng, will you fetch Tessai to my rooms? The girl scowled at the idea of leaving her, but at a stern look from her mentor, not to mention commanding officer, she sketched a quick bow and left in a flurry of footsteps. Finally left alone with the two males, Yoriyuki heaved a deep sigh and put her hands on her hips. Alright, Tsuzuki, put a bit more pressure on your injuries, we're going to need to walk. She eyed Kisuke, taking stock of the stiff way that he held himself, and extended her ryotsu until it wrapped securely around the other. Kisuke visibly relaxed his stance now that she was supporting most of his weight, and he gave her a small nod. They made it back to the clan head's residence with no further incident. It appeared that rumors of Tsuzuki had already begun spreading, and now the looks he received were contemplative rather than disparaging. Once inside, Yoriyuki disentangled her ryotsu from Kisuke, dropping him unceremoniously onto the tatami mats. The blonde rolled over into a more comfortable position with a grunt, but was evidently too exhausted to protest. Likely the run all the way from their training hideout and the prolonged council meeting had undid whatever recovery he had managed earlier. She had no doubt that he was already halfway to the Shihoan manor when he had asked her to monitor the situation, an impressive speed given that he could barely muster enough ryotsu for a shunpo. She turned her attention to Tsuzuki, who was similarly stretched out on the tatami mats, gingerly prodding at his ribs again. "How is Kisuke-san?" he asked upon noticing her eyes on him. Yoriyuki sighed. "Exhausted whatever ryotsu he had managed to build up earlier again, I suspect." "Oh." Tsuzuki's voice was small and quiet, and guilt reflected in the gaze that he turned on the blonde. Before Yoriyuki could say anything else, there was a polite knock on the doorframe and the shoji slid open to reveal Tessai and Sui Feng. "You asked for me, Yoriyuki Dano?" Tessai asked, eyes sweeping over the two men laid out on her floor. His eyebrows furrowed together slightly at the sight of Kisuke. "Tsuzuki, this is my childhood friend, Tsukubishi Tessai," she introduced. "Tessai, this is my adopted heir as of today, Shihoan Tsuzuki." "Hajime Mashite, Shihoan Dano." Tessai bowed formally. "Call me Tsuzuki," replied the youth, struggling for a moment to sit up to return the bow. "I'm sorry, I think I have some broken ribs and can't get up at the moment." He waved vaguely at his chest rather sheepishly, eyes fixed upon Tessai's face. To divert Tessai's attention and snap the youth out of his shock at seeing the much younger Tessai, Yoriyuki added, "He was in a battle with Katsuo earlier." At this, Tessai's eyes flew to hers and he inclined his head slowly at the unspoken concern, well aware of Katsuo's capabilities. Sinking fluidly onto the tatami mats in a seiza position, the man gestured to the aforementioned area. "May I?" Tsuzuki nodded slightly, and then sighed as the area was bathed in the green light of Kaido. "Thank you, Tsukubishi-san." The big man inclined his head. "Tessai is fine, Tsuzuki Dano." "Thank you, Tessai-san," Tsuzuki repeated, giving the other a shaky smile. He heaved himself upright experimentally, and his smile became more genuinely pleased at the lack of pain, while Tessai moved to Kisuke's side. "What happened?" he asked in a quiet aside, well aware of Sui Feng by the door. "Ryotsu exhaustion," she murmured back in an equally hushed tone. His brows drew together as he began the diagnostic Kaido. After a moment, the green light disappeared. "There's nothing physically wrong save for a few bruises," he reported. "Ryotsu-wise, I would recommend he take at least a few days off to fully regain his strength, a week if possible." The glasses glinted in the low light, the unspoken query clear in them. "You know how he gets," Yoriyuki deflected partially, but relented slightly in the face of her other childhood friend. "The way he pushes himself beyond his limits when he thinks it's necessary." She met Tessai's eyes, and they shared an understanding look. Satisfied, Tessai nodded, and rose, no doubt drawing his own conclusions. "Well," Yoriyuki told them brightly, clapping her hands together. "I guess I'll have to save the grand tour for tomorrow, then." Her smile turned just this hint of evil as she added, "including all these lovely training grounds that we would have so much fun exploring in great detail." Hearing the implication in her words, Tsuzuki gave a heartfelt groan and flopped back down. "So, where are we going?" Yukimaru gave Ishine a sideways glance, twitching minutely when Ishine didn't answer. His original plan had been to wander around Rukanga until he found a district that he liked. District 78 would be nice, that Zaraki guy was from 80, and he didn't feel like running into that madman yet. At least, not when he didn't even have a Zanpakuto. He loved a good fight as much as the next Aaron car, but he wasn't suicidal. However, Ishine seemed to already have a destination in mind. Goatface never failed to be annoying even when he wasn't trying, he lamented in his mind. "You'll see," Ishine replied cryptically. He wasn't going to call the man Oto-chan no matter how much he whined about them being one big happy family now, and Ichigo, no, wait, it was Tsuzuki now, wasn't it, had always backed him up wholeheartedly on this, usually with a well-aimed kick to the face. Yukimaru closed his eyes briefly, reining in the urge to just take off on his own. Goatface was probably waiting for him to do precisely that, so that he could be hauled back like some disobedient child. Although, he couldn't help but wonder if Ishine could actually catch him, if he truly decided to make a break for it. He was, after all, a student of the goddess of Flash herself. It would probably take Sui Feng at least to have a chance. Ishine raised a sardonic eyebrow, as if guessing his intentions. Yukimaru scowled. They had been traveling for a while now, flitting across the rooftops at a speed too high for any non-seated Shinigami to detect, to say nothing of ordinary civilians. Their riots were suppressed to such a point that even a senior officer would have trouble sensing them, so even if there had been someone with eyes capable of following their movements, they would likely be written off as a hallucination. The imposing gates separating the districts from each other posed no trouble for them, who could clear the top of the boundary wall with a single leap. They were there to stop the civilians from mass migrating and potentially causing overpopulation in the lower districts of Rukanga, a leftover relic from the first Soul King, not Shinigami. We're here. Yukimaru eyed the district number painted on the gate they had just passed. 68. Well, at least it was reasonably dangerous. He would have preferred somewhere in the 70s, but he supposed that he could always accidentally wander off after Ishine left. The boundary wall only marked the borders of the populated areas, but much of Rukanga still comprised of unchanged ardoured wilderness even back in their own time. It wasn't like the natural wildlife would be much of a threat to him. A horrible thought surfaced. Ishine wasn't taking him to a Shiba clan house, was he? He quickly shook his head. No, even the Shiba weren't insane enough to build a branch property in a district so far out, where help would take hours or even days to arrive. He turned to Ishine, about to interrogate the other man, but his voice died in his throat at the look on the other man's face. Ishine was standing stock still, face turned towards the horizon. He didn't seem to be looking at anything in particular, but his eyes were ever so slightly glazed over and the faintest shadow of a smile was tugging at the corner of his lips. It wasn't a happy smile. Yukimaru wished that he knew what to call it, because he'd seen it before, albeit only in King's memories, on the rare occasions where the twins weren't around and King chanced upon Ishine gazing at Masaka's poster. He turned his attention to the street. There were a couple of roadside stalls, if they could be loosely termed as such, with hawk-eyed shopkeepers hovering over the scant few shoppers. In a district this high up, few people had the gone to buy what they needed, so thieves were the rule rather than the exception. Speaking of which, come back here, you worthless rats. A trio of children raced past, an irate shopkeeper hot on their heels. Yukimaru flicked a glance at what the boy in the lead was clutching in a white-knuckled fist. Food, From his vantage point on the roof, he could see the furtive glances the others along the street were giving the quartet, but no one moved to stop anyone. It was better not to interfere, lest you get blacklisted by either the farmers or the gangs. The children rounded a corner out of his sight, but it was immediately followed by a loud crash and the thuds of bodies hitting the ground. Yukimaru scrambled to the edge of the roof, where he could look down and see the children in a groaning pile on the ground. The panting shopkeeper was only a few moments behind, striding up to them before they managed to untangle themselves. Pale-faced, the boy shoved the two girls behind him, turning to face the shopkeeper defiantly. I'll pay for that. Yukimaru blinked and leaned out further, catching the silhouette of a woman in the shadows under the awning of the roof he was perched on. Ah, so they hadn't tripped as he had first thought, they had run into someone. Although, that is a ridiculously generous offer, why would she do that? Maybe one of the children was hers? It's fine if I pay for them, isn't it? The shopkeeper squinted at her, but relented with a huff. That'll be 20 gone. Ignoring the outraged protest, his sign said 10 gone. Behind her, the woman counted several coins into the shopkeeper's hand. He frowned down at them, before pocketing the money and leaving the way he had come. The children lingered, the boy opening his mouth as if to speak. It was my fault you were caught, so I'll do it this once. His mouth snapped shut with a click audible even to Yukimaru. After a moment, he bowed respectfully at a 90-degree angle, pushing the younger girl's head down until she bowed too, while the other girl followed his lead. Then they turned, and took off at a run. Thank you very much, Kurosaka-san. Wait. What? The woman left the shade of the overhang for the brightly lit street, and for a moment Yukimaru could only stare at the waterfall of reddish-brown curls cascading down her back as she walked away, the achingly familiar sight branding itself into his eyes. A hand landed on his shoulder. Yukimaru gasped, drawing in a large gulp of air. Only then did he realize his lungs were on fire, his stomach turning over as though he had eaten something bad, and for some reason he was feeling like someone had just punched him. Human emotions were so confusing. He channeled all his confusion into anger instead, because anger at least he understood. Explain. Ishine sighed, dropping down to sit on the roof with a last glance in the direction his future wife? Past wife? Had gone. I've told you how your mother and I met. Yukimaru gave a brusque nod. She saved you from a hollow when you were on a mission. Ishine rubbed a hand over his eyes. That wasn't the full truth. He paused for a moment, and Yukimaru had to bite his own lip to prevent his impatience from interrupting. It wasn't the first time I'd met her. Well, he corrected, technically, it was the first time that I'd met her in that life. Yukimaru abruptly, that he needed to sit down too. He wished that Ichigo, Tsuzuki, stop slipping up. King was having this conversation with his father, not him. You knew her before she was reincarnated as our mother, he repeated flatly. Ishine bobbed his head, eyes still far away. The story slipped out in bits and pieces, how Ishine had first met her while on his way back from a mission, how Masaki, true to the memory of her that Yukimaru possessed, had taken one look at his injuries and offered him a place to stay for a night. How Ishine had, after that, gone back again and again whenever he could find the chance, as though he were a moth drawn to her flame. I was going to ask her to take my name. The light in his eyes dimmed, then, and Yukimaru knew without asking him to elaborate how this story would end. The only way to be reincarnated, after all, was to die in Soul Society. That kid, he said Kurosaka-san. He seized upon the peculiarity before Ishine could do something worse, like start bawling on him. What's the chance of someone being reincarnated into the exact same family? Ishine blinked slowly at him, eyes soft with emotions Yukimaru didn't want to, identify. You know that Masaka was an Quincy, he prompted, receiving a nod in reply. During the Quincy War about 1,000 years ago, Shinigami scientists had observed that the offspring of two Quincy usually had much greater Ryotsu reserves than either of the parents. Desperate to win the war, the Quincy families began practicing the tradition of pure marriages, producing children with disproportionately large reserves of Ryotsu, able to stand up to even Shinigami captains. And one of them is the Kurosaka family? Guessed Yukimaru. The corner of Ishine's mouth quirked up. Yes, he affirmed. To find out why, Shinigami scientists tracked the reincarnation cycles of several Quincy families, and they found something. His mouth twisted on the word, interesting. After death, a Quincy's Ryotsu is locked within the soul, such that they pass off as regular Ryokonga civilians. Some may have slightly higher than average Ryotsu, but generally not enough to pass the Shinigami Academy entrance examination. And when two Quincy have a child, the chance of this child being the reincarnation of one of their ancestors is much higher than usual. Scientists had reported seeing the same soul, over a period of several centuries, be reincarnated into the exact same family every single time. So, Yukimaru struggled to follow the logic, the idea almost too preposterous to consider. So in addition to the parent's Ryotsu, the child also inherits the latent Ryotsu reserves from a previous reincarnation. Yukimaru opened his mouth, and then closed it again. It was insane. And yet, the story of how Masaki had killed White, the hollow that had grievously wounded a Shinigami captain, with a single shot. Her shooting at point blank had nothing to do with it. The 11th Division could hack away at Zaraki all day and no one under 5th seat would be able to score a single wound on him. It took power of an equal or greater amount to actually make a spiritual being bleed. How Ishine had always said, if she hadn't lost her powers, Grand Fisher would never have been able to lay a single hand on her. The image of Ishida Ryokan amidst a sea of hollows, face utterly blank as he took down a Vastolord ranked Arrancar by himself, something that none of the Shinigami could lay claim to. And, of course, the Wandenreich, any of whom was a match for a Shinigami captain. Take care of her for me, will you? A blink, and he found Ishine already standing, dusting himself off. Without another word, the lieutenant crouched, and then leapt off the roof, headed back the way they had come. Yukimaru turned to face the blazing afternoon sun, the gentlest of breezes brushing against his cheek. I will, Oyoji. West Ryokonga District 68 was a typical cluster of hamlets of the kind seen in some of King's history textbooks about the Heian era. Though, those mostly focused on the imperial court and the aristocrats, and were thus of absolutely no help whatsoever to Yukimaru's current situation. It didn't take long, lurking on rooftops, to find out that newcomers to the district invariably went two ways: they were picked up by an existing household, or they ended up in one of the gangs. Rare were the special cases, those who did neither. There was one such man, boy, really, on the cusp of manhood, a few days ago, who had declared in the middle of the market square that he was a Fujiwara, and had been quickly ushered away by an officious man backed by several bodyguards. Just this morning, Yukimaru saw him leave through the gate to District 67, ensconced in a palanquin bearing the name Kono on the side. That kid's an utter idiot. What would he have done if this was a district ruled by the Terra or the Minamoto instead? The who? Honestly, Tsuzuki huffed a breath of laughter, flopping down on the ground and crossing his arms behind his head. You could figure out that you're in the Heian era, but you didn't remember the major clans of that era? Yukimaru gave a half-shrug, mirroring Tsuzuki's position. How would I know that the aristocracy in the transient world would translate directly into noble clans in Seoul society? Tsuzuki arched an eyebrow at him. You just saw why today. Enough of those who could remember their pasts, demanding to be accorded the same luxuries as they had enjoyed in life, and you get a noble clan. Anyway, the Kono are retainers of the Fujiwara, so they've probably sent him on to the Fujiwara stronghold in District 51. It was funny. The ground should have been cold, seeing that it was made of what appeared to be obsidian, but it wasn't, not really, it pulsed internally with some unknown source of warmth. He gave the ground a suspicious look. Hopefully there wasn't a volcano buried under all that. I don't think our own mindscape can try to kill us. He scowled at the man who was supposed to be his brother now, all things considered. One day, these words will come back and bite you on the ass. King had, after all, nearly drowned in his own mindscape that one memorable time. Tsuzuki flapped a hand at him. Suit yourself. I'd be more worried about out there rather than in here. Not like anyone can find me, Yukimaru replied absently, propping himself up on one elbow so that he could tap the ground. There was a pregnant pause at that. Tsuzuki turned his head slowly to face him. Yuki, where exactly are you right now? Ano, Yukimaru scratched his head. There's a forest on the outskirts of the populated areas, and if you go in deep enough the trees are pretty big and comfortable. He trailed off at the look on Tsuzuki's face, at the emotions pulsing bright and clear next to him, exasperation and amusement and resignation all at once. So basically, Tsuzuki summarized drily, you were so antisocial that you decided to make like Tarzan. He protested, the litany automatically falling from his lips, even as he considered the term. No, he didn't think antisocial applied. It's more of, I don't know, he scrubbed a hand through his hair in frustration. They aren't trying to kill me. The amusement beside him bled away slowly. They aren't trying to kill you, but neither are they people who had fought with you, bled with you, taken a sword through the chest for you. Their eyes met and held for a long moment, and then Tsuzuki blew out a long breath. Yeah, I get what you mean. Yukimaru sat up. How do you cope? He demanded. I tried to walk down the street, but it was just so hard to hold myself back, to not react when they passed too near, to not respond as I would to a threat. How do you do it? I think of those early days, before the Winter War started in earnest, when I could still pretend to be a normal high school student, just one who moonlights as a Shinigami substitute. Tsuzuki gave a right twitch of his lips. It helps that few people dare to crowd the heir of the clan, and neither Yorine nor Kisuk-san registers as a threat. Yukimaru gave him a completely blank stare. My first memory is of you, he reminded, your fingers still brushing across the Hogyaku embedded in Aizen's chest, his features twisted unrecognizable in rage, right before he swatted you through 6 walls. The first time he had manifested outside King's mindscape, discombobulated and disoriented, sprawled ungainly over the rubble. The first time he took a shuddering breath and saw the world through his own eyes, felt the sharp debris cut into his skin, tasted the dust lingering in the air. The first time he could stop and think, crystal clear, without the hurricane of 1,000 voices in his ear, howling at him to rip tear kill. They were still present, in the background, but muted somehow, more akin to a draft than a tempest, something he could ignore with the ease of decades of practice. The first time he met Aizen Sosuke face to face, he had staggered to his feet, weak as a newborn kitten, and seen the cruel smirk tugging at the madman's lips. Kneel and be welcome, my newest Aaron Carr. As a hollow, survival had always been the most important thing. Eat or be eaten, kill or be killed. The world was colored a blessedly simple black and white. When someone stronger than you came along, you bowed to them, to survive. No doubt that was why even the self-proclaimed king of Hueco Mundo, Baragan Lusenbairn, had swallowed his pride and knelt for Aizen. The first time he had the ability to make his own choices, Yukimaru had reached instinctively for his Zanpakuto. Aizen had not been pleased. It was also the first time he had died, speared through and through by a strike too fast to see, and he hadn't even seen Aizen move. No, it wasn't a good memory, but it was all he had. Oh. Tsuzuki's eyes slid shut and he grimaced. Right. You were born in the middle of the war. Yukimaru snorted. Sharing your head for 4 years must have messed with mine, because no self-respecting hollow would have done that. They'd have knelt, to live another day. Startled brown eyes snapped open and fixed on him. Do you regret it? Tsuzuki asked almost hesitantly. Yukimaru didn't need to share his mind to know what Tsuzuki was thinking, that the other had somehow subconsciously influenced him into making that uncharacteristic choice. Don't insult me, snapped Yukimaru with feeling. The first time my mind was my own, the first time I could think for myself, and I chose to do that. The miasma of guilt persisted, pric cling uncomfortably against his skin like a particularly scratchy sweater, and he growled, rolling to his feet. Let's spar. Tsuzuki blinked up at him. Eh? Yukimaru stretched languidly, feeling the pull in his muscles. Knowing you, you'd somehow manage to make it rain in here too. I'm going to beat it out of you before that happens. He dropped to all fours, and without giving Tsuzuki the chance to even get up, swept out a leg with enough force to break a bone on impact. Except that it never connected. The moment he had crouched down, Tsuzuki had already started moving, and instead of wasting time scrambling to his feet he had gone for a backwards roll instead, pushing himself upright with his arms and leaping backwards to put more distance between them. Yukimaru grinned savagely. Yuriyuki-san was going to rue the day she taught Tsuzuki, and thus by extension Yukimaru as well, how to incorporate gymnastics into his already eclectic Hakuda style. He almost felt sorry for the Shihoin clan. Almost. They wouldn't know what hit them, literally. What was that for? Complained Tsuzuki, though he didn't relax his stance. He could feel the grin on his face widen of its own accord, see the wariness melt off into hard resolve in Tsuzuki's eyes in response. Good. He hadn't had a decent fight for weeks, not since they'd found out the hard way that Aizen had resurrected his entire Arrancar army again. With the resistance numbering so few by then, sending anyone out would have been a suicidal move without fresh intel, and so they had remained holed up in Urahara Shoten. Yukimaru had never intended to hit Tsuzuki with that move, knowing that instincts if nothing else would have made the other dodge. Nice to see you haven't completely lost your edge in your dotage, he replied breezily, and without waiting for a response lunged. Tsuzuki planted his feet firmly against the ground, raising an arm to block Yukimaru's initial punch. Sparks of black riot so flew where fist met forearm, and Tsuzuki's other arm snaked out, lightning fast, to grab Yukimaru's outstretched arm. Instead of struggling, Yukimaru allowed himself to be pulled closer, the sudden loss of resistance buying him the split second of surprise he needed to duck into instead of away from Tsuzuki and flip him over his shoulder in a judo throw. To his credit, though Yukimaru wouldn't have expected any less, Tsuzuki landed in a perfect roll, slapping the ground with a Ryatsu-enhanced hand to propel himself backwards. He was already on his feet as he landed, skidding backwards in a ready stance. Yukimaru smirked. Looks like he was finally going to take it seriously. As though cued by a silent signal, they burst into Shunpo at the same moment, exchanging a flurry of Ryatsu-enhanced strikes, deflecting what they couldn't evade. Karate strikes mixed with jabs at pressure points meshed together with staple street brawl punches, moves from a dozen different styles flowing fluidly into each other with the long experience only gained from a decade of fighting, first against humans, then against all manners of spiritual beings. When the Winter War had taken a swing for the worse, Yuriyuki had pulled aside the humans, easily the least experienced in the resistance, and demanded to see their unarmed combat styles. Orium had used a textbook karate style, the way that Tatsuki had taught her. Chad's repertoire favored power over subtlety, featuring a variety of boxing moves. Urayu had pulled out some Quincy style from somewhere, all the while rather peevishly muttering that it was nearly impossible to disarm him and therefore all this was really rather unnecessary. His spar had ended with him face planted in the ground and glaring balefully up at Yuriyuki, who casually, pointedly, twirled his Quincy cross around one index finger. Then it was their turn. Yuriyuki wasn't known as a Hakuda master for nothing, and thus despite being clearly caught off guard by King's unorthodox moves, she dodged without missing a beat. After a mere few minutes of going on the defensive, she had switched to the offensive. All of her blows, the duo had quickly found out, didn't seem to have much force behind them, but they hurt. It was one of those times when Yukimaru wished that pain didn't transmit into the mindscape whenever he decided to lend King his Ryatsu. I target nerve clusters, she had explained, after calling the spar to a halt. Even though it had barely been half an hour, every inch of them had ached and rattled as though she had shaken their very bones apart. To add insult to injury, the way she just seemed to twist away from all their attacks, even when enhanced with Yukimaru's speed, made them suspect that she had the advantage of preternatural feline agility. When King had called her out on it, a familiar glint in her eye that they had come to associate, painfully, with nothing good appeared. Oi, Kisuk. On the far side of the underground training grounds, Urahara Kisuk turned in their direction, one hand still holding some instrument that he had been fiddling with. Grey eyes widened comically as Yoryuki was suddenly in his personal space, foot flying towards his face in a move they had seen countless times from Hiyori, except Hiyori had never moved so fast. It was clear that the title Goddess of Flash was well deserved. Had she just crossed the entirety of the training grounds in a single blink? Then King's mouth fell open when Kisuk bent over backwards at the waist until blonde hair swept the ground, his free hand shooting out to keep his bucket hat from falling off. Yukimaru would have laughed at Ichigo's resemblance to a fish, if he himself wasn't also busy gaping in astonishment when the shopkeeper neatly swiveled his waist to twist his upper body around the downward blow Yoryuki aimed at his chest, and then pivoted 180 on one foot to bring his own leg up to block her follow-up kick. This is fragile, he had protested, cradling the gadget protectively to his chest without so much as a wobble, looking for all the world as though he was so used to balancing on one leg that he hardly noticed the difference. Ignoring him with apparently the ease of long practice, Yoryuki grinned at her captive audience, lowering her leg slowly. As you can see, she had announced, the look on her face rather reminiscent of a cat with a saucer of cream, it can be learnt. Kisuk blinked in bemusement, looking from her to the teenagers. Did I miss something? Instead of trying to correct his Hakuda into something more conventional, like so many other instructors would have done, Yoryuki had taken one look at Ichigo's formless style and given him the tools to turn it into the finely honed weapon it was today. His hand-to-hand had never been bad, but usually it was a case of him giving as good as he got, and he had had many a black eye to show for it. Yoryuki showed him how she could not only hold her own, but come out on top in a world populated by giants brandishing even more gigantic swords. How the extra reach that their weapons granted them meant nothing when they couldn't hope to hit her even at close range, a feat that only a combination of her speed and flexibility could achieve. Speaking of which, I doubt either of us did our daily exercises in the past few days. Tsuzuki clapped a hand to his forehead, straightening. Ugh, don't tell her. At an unspoken agreement, they both turned to gaze into the endless horizon. Yukimaru bounced lightly on the ground. It would have to do, it wasn't like either of them risked falling from doing basic exercises, anyway. 500 cartwheels, here we come, muttered Tsuzuki cheerlessly, looking grimly resolute. We are never telling her about this, warned Tsuzuki, flopping down on the ground in exhaustion after having crammed 5 days' worth of exercise into one day. She'll triple the current exercise regimen for her own sadistic pleasure. And probably have the time limit, Yukimaru added, agreeing wholeheartedly. About to open his mouth to no doubt commiserate, Tsuzuki shut it with a click, brow furrowed in faint concentration. Someone just entered my room. Without warning, his body shimmered and vanished from their mindscape. Yukimaru sat up straight, alarms pounding in his head. The intruder wasn't someone whom Tsuzuki had recognized, and thus by virtue of that fact was most likely not an ally. On the upside, it wasn't Aizen. On the downside, well, there was a lot of room for error between Aizen and not a threat. He got to his feet and began pacing, unable to sit still anymore. King would be fine, the only Shinigami who could pose a threat to him right now was probably Aizen, and the Soteiko, he supposed, and several of the eldest captains, but what were the chances of them sneaking into Tsuzuki's bedroom in the middle of the night? A brief vision of Anohana climbing through the window of Tsuzuki's bedroom like Renji used to do popped into his mind, and he had to stifle a very inappropriate snicker. The ground trembled. Yukimaru's right hand whipped instinctively to his back before he belatedly realized that, no, he didn't have Zanjutsu strapped to his back anymore. Nor could he materialize in front of Tsuzuki anymore, he supposed. His hand clenched into a fist at the thought. Having spent most of his life in the other man's mindscape, he could recognize the signs immediately. For whatever reason, Tsuzuki had just released the tight hold he normally had over his Ryutsu. Although the ground was no longer shaking, concentric circles of disturbance continued rippling outwards from where he stood. With an effort, Yukimaru dragged his gaze off the ground. The dissonance between the stillness of the air and the movement in the ground was disorientating. A shift in the air alerted to the sudden appearance of his Zanpakuto spirit behind him. You wish to go to him? It wasn't phrased as a question, but he replied anyway for lack of anything better to do. Of course. Why? Yukimaru's head swiveled around, pinning his Zanpakuto spirit with an incredulous look. Why? What kind of question was that? He needs me. The figure's serene expression didn't change. Does he? Without giving Yukimaru the chance to retort, the spirit continued, you just said it yourself. Save for Aizen, no one else is likely to pose any danger to Tsuzuki at this time of the night. And Shiho in Yoriyuki is but a single room away from him. Does he really need your assistance? Its gaze sharpened. Or are you simply craving bloodshed, little hollow? It took Yukimaru several moments to find his voice, and even longer to formulate a coherent response. How dare you, he snarled. I may have been a hollow once, but that has nothing to do with. Do you deny your heritage? I have been many things, snapped back Yukimaru. I have been a hollow, then a Zanpakuto spirit, then a hollow-fied spirit, and finally an Arankar. This doesn't change who I am now. Ah, yes, an Arankar. Tell me, former Arankar, what was your aspect of death? Yukimaru's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, momentarily thrown by the question. Defiance. His voice was quiet, but his chin was up, just daring the spirit to challenge him on that. He wasn't necessarily proud of the fact, an Arankar's aspect of death was, after all, their main weakness and what usually got them killed, but it was a part of him, and to hell with anyone who dared to tell him that defying Aizen had been the stupid move. Did they think he didn't already know all that? If he'd knelt for Aizen that day, the war would have been over long ago. The newly born Arankar had access to all of King's memories, starting with the locations of and the passwords to every single resistance stronghold. He had no doubt Aizen would have been able to imprison King within his own mindscape, leaving him in charge of the physical body. It would have been horribly easy to pass off as the human teenager, moody and sullen wasn't hard to pull off, and to shred the wards protecting Urahara Shoten when Aizen came knocking. The wards had been designed to withstand traitors from the inside, of course, but King had helped to erect the wards in the first place with his massive Ryotsu reserves, and was thus keyed into the foundations. He could have been on the winning side of the war. And yet, knowing all of that, you challenged Aizen anyway. Eyes the hue of sunset pierced through him. Drunk on your newfound freedom, engorged with your own self-importance, did you do it for the novelty of making a choice? Yukimaru's growl was very nearly subsonic, and the ground shivered with his rising Ryotsu. I would have thought my own Zanpakuto spirit would have known me better than that. He couldn't quite hide the disappointment dripping from his words, though his tone remained acerbic. I did it because it was the right thing to do. Unbidden, an image of Karen and Yuzu on their first day of middle school floated to mind. It had been before the war had started in earnest, and their big brother had specially taken the time to see them off at the school gates. It was possibly the last time he had seen King smile. There are some things in this world worth fighting for, worth dying for. He breathed in, deeply. Yes, I like fighting, he was mature enough to admit that, but I'm not a hollow anymore. I don't fight for the sake of causing mindless destruction. If you can't accept a former hollow for a wielder, then fine, I don't need you. Better a soulless sword than a Zanpakuto that didn't trust its owner, or worse, actively undermined its owner. One Quincy Zanjutsu was enough for one lifetime. His Zanpakuto spirit inclined its head regally, and for a moment the perpetual flames cloaking it grew too bright for him to keep his eyes on the enshrouded figure within. We will speak again. When he looked up again, Yukimaru found himself standing alone once more. He blinked rapidly in bewilderment. What had all that been about? It being only mid-February, Rakonga was still caught in the throes of winter. Sitting on a convenient fallen log, Yukimaru examined his only change of clothing critically. There was no helping it, he decided. He would have to venture back to town. At least he didn't smell. The nearby stream, after he had successfully cracked the ice, made for a decent bath, a steady source of water, and some fish. He was even getting better at creating campfires with judicious applications of fire keto on hapless twigs. However, that begged the question, what could he use to trade for a new set of clothes? He owned literally nothing but the clothes on his back, and they weren't in the best condition after so many repeated washes. Perhaps he would have more luck scouting out the town beforehand. Surely he could find something that he could do. Yukimaru hopped off the log, pulled his clothes back on, and started the long trek back to civilization. He was a genius, he decided, peering out at the town from the relative safety atop a tree. Firewood. Each of the hamlets had a small bundle of firewood stacked neatly against one of the walls, visible through the window. He crept closer, peeking into each of the windows, trying to see if he could find which one his mother lived in. He didn't meet with much luck, unfortunately, and it was already getting dark. He could probably spend the night gathering as much fallen branches as possible, and head back during daylight hours. Thus decided, he turned, and was about to head back to the tree-line, when a quiet scuffle caught his attention. Making a split-second decision, Yukimaru crouched and easily leapt onto the roof of the nearest hamlet, using the roofs as a shortcut to reach where the sound was coming from faster. "Don't make me hurt you, woman." His ears pricked and he scrambled sideways, slinking closer to the edge of the roof for a better view. "You can't," a familiar voice replied coolly, and his heart did some sort of jittery flutter. His mother had a bag tucked under her arm, a burly man blocking her path. From the symbol sewn onto his clothes, he was probably a member of a gang. He didn't look too happy at the implied insult to his abilities. His mother frowned, ducking the clumsy punches thrown her way, but did not retaliate. Frustrated at his inability to hit her, the gang member charged. Without pausing, she shifted her position and stuck out a leg. He flailed as he tripped, hitting his head on the ground and letting out a yell of pain. That seemed to be the signal the rest of the gang was waiting for, as several more menacing figures sauntered out into the deserted street. The biggest one, obviously the gang leader from his demeanor, sneered and stepped forward while the rest fanned out to surround his mother. He had seen enough. Yukimaru hopped off the roof into a side alley and came barreling out before the gang leader could even open his mouth. "Hey!" he yelled. "What kind of cowards are you to gang up on a lady?" For a moment the gang members stood, stunned at the direct challenge. From the corner of his eye, he could see his mother pursing her lips worriedly, but did not warn him to stay away, trusting the newcomer to know what he was doing. Yukimaru appreciated it. A district so high up, a person did not stay alive by interfering in fights they could not win, and she clearly knew that she was outnumbered. Slowly, the gang leader turned to face him. At a slight gesture, the nearest two attacked. Yukimaru jumped over the first punch, using his momentum to kick the first one in the face and immediately ducking to avoid the second one from sneaking up on him. He effortlessly dispatched his other opponent, returning the gang leader's shrewd look with his own emotionless stare. "Get her!" White-hot fury seared through him. He was their opponent. Not her. Never her. He blurred in front of the nearest gang member, sending the man flying several meters away. The remaining hesitated, but at a rallying cry from their leader, charged en masse at his mother. Unacceptable. Eliminate. Stop. For a moment, he could only stare blankly at the woman blocking his way, his palm quivering scant centimeters away from her throat. He had barely pulled the blow in time, his reflexes screaming at him. Not a threat. Yukimaru blinked dazedly, withdrawing his hand slowly. Only then did he register the bodies littering the street, hear the occasional pained groan. Finish the job, his instincts were telling him. Eliminate the threats before they hurt someone you care about. Why did you stop me? His mother was watching him, wariness warring with worry in her eyes. Up close, he could see that King had indeed inherited his mother's eyes. You were going to kill them. They were going to kill you, countered Yukimaru, confused. If someone punched you, you punch them back, and make sure they can't get back up to punch your friends when you weren't around. Wasn't that how things worked? She shook her head, brown curls bouncing in the moonlight. They were only after the food. My life was never in danger. Before you intervened went unsaid. But they wanted to hurt you. He couldn't understand it. Why did you protect them? Because if somebody died because I did nothing, I don't think I'd be able to forgive myself for that. Her voice was soft, but resolute. Yukimaru scratched at his head, casting a dubious look in her direction. Well, if she insisted. He gave the gangsters one last glance, dismissing them almost immediately. None of them would be getting up any time soon. Now, what had he been about to do? Oh, yes, firewood. He had barely taken 5 steps towards the tree-line in the far distance when her voice stopped him again. Where are you going? Half turning, Yukimaru jerked a thumb in the vague direction where he had spent the last fortnight. I need to get back before it gets too dark to find my way. He could probably find a new place to sleep, since he hadn't left anything behind, but he liked where he'd stayed. It would be annoying to find another stream. Even in the gloom, he could see her begin to frown. I didn't know people lived in the forest. He turned his attention to the trees in surprise. There were others living in the forest besides him. I didn't know there were others, his reply was phrased in a questioning tone. At least, I haven't seen anyone else in the last 2 weeks. There was a pregnant pause, and then, are you telling me that you spent 2 weeks of winter alone in the forest? Yes, he replied slowly. I'm only in town today because I needed a new set of clothes. He gestured to the worn and faded garments he was wearing, and I came to see what other people needed, something that I could use to trade with. His mother looked as if she was trying to stop herself from saying something, although Yukimaru couldn't fully understand the expression on her face. He'd have to ask Tsuzuki to parse it later. Is something wrong? I have a spare room, she declared apropos of nothing. And I can make you a new set of clothes. In return, I need you to do some manual labor around the house. Yukimaru opened his mouth, and then closed it again. This could all be an elaborate trap, but then, given what he knew of his mother, this generosity seemed to be par for the course for her. I could gather firewood, he offered cautiously. And I'm pretty good with heavy lifting. Her eyes cut to the gangsters, some of whom had regained consciousness, and who were trying to slink away unobtrusively. I've noticed. Turning her back on them, she started down a different path leading to a cluster of hamlets near the rice fields. I live this way. Humans, Yukimaru decided as he trotted obediently behind her, were weird. Kurosaka Kyoko, or Kyoko-san as she had insisted he call her, was a weaver. She owned a modest plot of land in the fields, where she grew the fibers that she needed. It being winter, the fields didn't need tilling, though she had made it clear that come spring this would no longer be the case. Yukimaru didn't mind. In addition to chopping firewood, he helped out with the general repairs of the hamlet. It helped that he didn't have trouble keeping his footing on the snow-covered roofs, what were slippery roofs compared to fighting for your life, knee-deep in rubble? Although he did have to use a ladder to keep up appearances after the first time he scaled up the wall and nearly gave Kyoko a heart attack. Seeing this, she began sending him to the other villagers when their homes needed repairs, and before he knew it, he had somehow turned into the village handyman. Tsuzuki had been very amused. I wish there was more to eat, though, Yukimaru griped, laying out his futon beside the open window. Did you know that souls in Rokanga only need to eat once every few days? There was a thoughtful pause on the other end, or it could be that Tsuzuki had accidentally slipped out of Jinzen again. They were still ironing out the kinks of trying to communicate without actually entering their mindscape. Now I do, his brother finally replied. How are you coping? Kyoko-san looked weird when she realized that I was still regularly going into the forest. It had been an interesting conversation, to say the least. He had lost track of time one day, and night had crept up on him before he realized how late it was. He flitted into as fast a shunpo as he dared with such limited visibility. Tsuzuki would no doubt laugh himself sick if he ran into a tree, and made it to town in record time. Where were you? Kyoko-san had asked the moment he set foot through the door. Yukimaru glanced up sharply, momentarily stunned by her vehemence. He hesitated a moment, but the compulsion to be honest with his mother was too strong, damn Ichigo's morals, and he finally told her an abbreviated version of the truth. I was looking for alternative sources of food in the forest. Mother or not, he wasn't about to tell her that he needed at least one meal a day to survive. Everyone in Rokanga knew what it meant when someone was hungry. It's not that I don't trust her, he found himself explaining, needing someone to understand. If I'd told her, I know she'll insist on feeding me. In a town this small, the additional groceries she would need to buy wouldn't go unnoticed for long. And neither of you need the kind of attention this would bring, finished Tsuzuki quietly. The Kono will only respond in two ways, either they'll demand you join their guard retinue, or they'll kill you. His mother had eyed him contemplatively. Come back before dark, was all she said in the end. It's not safe out there at night. Yukimaru silently resolved to remember to bring his axe every time he entered the forest in the future, to make it look as if he was gathering firewood instead. He could almost hear Tsuzuki nod thoughtfully. She's worried about you, his brother explained. Worried? Yukimaru couldn't understand why. Wasn't it clear that he could handle himself already? It's an irrational emotion humans feel when someone whom they care about does something that they consider dangerous. Yukimaru snorted. You totally repeated that verbatim from Kisuke-san. Instead of protesting as he'd expected, Tsuzuki sent back the mental equivalent of a shrug. He's far more eloquent than I am. I would have said something like, it's what people do when they like you. His version is a lot more helpful, and explains why none of us is worried about you spending weeks in the forest. What's the worst thing you can stumble into? A nest of hollows. I wonder if hollows taste good barbecued? Mused Yukimaru. In response to Tsuzuki's slightly horrified silence, he retorted, what? I'm really sick of fish. I'll think of something, promised his brother. Let's leave that to a last resort, shall we? Winter melted slowly into spring, and gradually the days began to grow longer. When all the snow was finally gone, Kyoko began showing him how to work the fields. Yukimaru didn't mind the manual labor, because at least it was something to do. Not that he begrudged Tsuzuki his job, rather, had it been him he would probably have tried to murder half the clan within the week. King had far more patience and empathy than he did. Seriously, he didn't even maim those idiotic brats that had burst into his room the other day, interrupting their conversation. People who waited until their target was asleep, or so they thought, to act couldn't have been up to any good. If it were up to him, he'd have given them a lot worse than a mere slap on the wrist, like maybe a little bit of maiming. If Sui Feng could fight with one arm, he was sure they could learn to do the same. Well, King had been so startled by the intrusion that he had accidentally flared his riot suit, and that had woken up Yoriyuki. Those brats had probably gotten what they deserved, he supposed. That cat was vicious if her nap time was interrupted. Though, it was equally probable that she ended up punishing Tsuzuki, since it was his fault that she had awoken at all. He snickered to himself, ignoring all the odd looks shot his way. Man, he was so glad he wasn't entangled in that mess. A roar shook the forest. Yukimaru nearly dropped the bundle in his arms, turning to gape at the tree-line. Nearby, other farmers straightened up slowly from their own crops, and he could see a few pick up whatever blunt instrument they had at hand. The fields were located on the outskirts of town, and judging by the increasing sounds of crashing they could all hear, there wasn't enough time to escape. Not that some of them didn't try, tearing down the dirt road back to town. Yukimaru shook his head. Stupid, it wasn't like there was a magical barrier protecting the town. Whatever that the hunting party had enraged wouldn't be stopped by flimsy wooden constructs. All they would be doing was effectively inciting a panic. He'd seen the hunting party go in earlier that day, a pack of dogs snapping at their heels, and had been looking forwards to what they could bring back. Vegetables were good and all, but he was seriously craving some meat here, one of the disadvantages of growing up with an abundance of food in the late 20th century. Meat had always been in plentiful supply back in the future. Looks like we won't be getting deer tonight, he sighed woefully. A nearby farmer snorted, hefting his pitchfork. We should probably worry about not becoming bear food first. A bear? The farmer squinted at him. Yeah, big brown furry animal with claws. I know what a bear is, Yukimaru snapped back. To his surprise, the farmer gave him a nod of apology. My apologies. For what? He had to ask. Usually when he snapped at people, they yelled back at him, not apologized to him. And especially not one so senior to him, as this man clearly was. Well, someone as young as you usually only knows what a bear looks like because you died from being attacked by one. Yukimaru paused. How did he know what a bear looked like? The answer came easily, of course, Ichigo had once seen one in a zoo. Ah, that explained a lot. Did they even have zoos in this time period? Even saying that he had seen a picture from a book would be suspect. Apparently, most of the inhabitants, most of Rokanga in fact, were illiterate. Yukimaru was really thankful that Tsuzuki had imparted that piece of vital information before he accidentally outed himself with the fact that he could both read and write. Picture books were rare and expensive, only found in noble households. To say that he had read one would been tantamount to admitting he was a noble-born child. And wouldn't the Kono have a field day with that tidbit? Man, he really missed the future. Another roar thundered through the forest, and this time he could pick up the howling of dogs and the snapping of tree branches, even without channeling Ryotsu to his ears to enhance his hearing. They must be close then. Yukimaru hefted his own hoe, testing the weight of it in his hand. It was such a pity he no longer had a Zanpakuto strapped to his back, not that he needed one, necessarily, but displaying advanced Hakuta skills was just begging for a trip to the Kono's prisoner cells. He really didn't want to live as a criminal on the run for the next century. Or worse, have to call upon the Shihoin to bail him out, and ruin all their careful planning. So that meant, no advanced Hakuta, no Hoho, no Kido, and no obvious Zanjutsu. At least he didn't have to worry about this last one. Ichigo had never been taught Zanjutsu to start with. There just hadn't been enough time during the war to instruct him in the proper stances that would normally take years to perfect. Yukimaru twirled the hoe in one hand, feeling the familiar maniacal grin tug at his lips. He did so love a challenge. A flash of brown, barely visible through the thicket of trees, was all the warning he got before a blur burst out from the tree-line, a wasteland of snapped branches trailing in its wake. Almost immediately, his hands shifted their grip on the handle before he consciously unclenched one hand. This wasn't a katana. He didn't need two hands to wield it. His left foot slid back a fraction, bracing the majority of his weight against the ground. Any idea where the weaknesses are on a bear? Probably the eyes, if he could reach those. Few things, be they animals, humans, Shinigami, or hollows, could handle the loss of an eye. He wondered if he could manage to take a paw off. No, too risky, he had to make it look like he'd gotten lucky. Someone broke under the stress, screaming and charging at the bear. Small beady eyes zeroed in on the approaching threat, the bear changing directions to meet it head-on. Even he had to wince at the resultant wet squelch of shredded flesh and the screech of claws along bone. Civilians were so fragile. Do I want to know? His brother's reply was part exasperated, part apprehensive. I'm going to kill one. Yukimaru cocked his head, narrowing his eyes at the rampaging bear. It was pissed. He supposed that he couldn't really blame it. If some idiot intruded on his territory, he'd probably have reacted the same way. Scratch that, this bear was intruding on his territory. Tsuzuki had yet to reply, so it was going to have to be the eyes then. He doubted that this hoe, with its flimsy quality, could reach the less exposed parts anyway. Congratulations. You just managed to render Kisuke-san speechless for a record 10 seconds. The snicker that Yukimaru involuntarily let escape was probably terrifying the other civilians, but what did he care about that? And what did he say? There was a slight pause, and then Kisuke's voice came smoothly over their mental connection. Setting aside the question of why you are facing a bear as of this moment, the eyes and the mouth when open are vulnerable parts. Yukimaru cocked his head. There was no way even Urahara Kisuke could find his riot Surib in almost 70 districts into the Rokanga, which meant he had been piggybacking on King's connection to him. He didn't even know that was possible. Wasn't Ryotsu unique to each person or something like that? He shook his head, grip tightening on his makeshift weapon, eyes tracking the movements of the bear. Eyes and mouth. He could reach that. Iti kamesu. Itarasai, Tsuzuki replied automatically, before squawking at him. What? Where are you going? Yukimaru ignored him in favor of bending his knees slightly. The bear was currently on a trajectory that would take it within lunging distance to him. He breathed in and out, slowly, focus narrowing down to the threat. Incoming. He dropped automatically and rolled out of the way, just as a pair of panicked oxen trampled through where he had been standing a moment ago. Yukimaru came up, cursing, foot slipping on the freshly tilled soil. Too late, he realized that his instinctive maneuver had brought him almost directly into the path of the bear, and he gritted his teeth, bracing himself for the impact. Small beady locked on his figure, the bear giving a low enraged growl as it spotted him. Come and get me, Yukimaru whispered, twirling the hoe absently in both hands until they found a grip that they liked. His brain stuttered out an alert, forcing him to sidestep again just as a body crashed heavily into the ground next to him. The farmer from earlier, he vaguely recognized. Not a threat, analyzed the small part of his brain not devoted to tracking the weak points on the bear. Protect. Yukimaru crouched slightly, and then sprang. His aim was true, and the hoe smashed into the bear's face, carving a bloody slash from brow to cheek. The bear howled in agony and fury, giant paws coming up to claw at the air, half blinded by the blood streaming freely from one ruined eye. Yukimaru cursed again, abandoning the hoe and leaping backwards before they could make contact. With a final scream, the bear tore the hoe from its face, flinging it away. Keeping the enraged bear in his peripheral vision, he glanced wildly around for a substitute makeshift weapon. Bare-handed combat was far too dangerous in this situation, slipping up and accidentally revealing his skills was not an option here. There. It took 2 long strides to reach the abandoned trowel, snatch it up, and swivel back around to face the bear. Yukimaru hefted it in one hand, considering. Not very sharp, he'd either have to use more force, or aim for blunt trauma. He spun it in one hand while the bear narrowed its beady little eyes on him again, dropping to all fours, absently tossing it up and catching it on the way down. Wait a minute. Yukimaru frowned considering. Yes, this could work. The trowel thudded back into his palm, and he curled his fingers over the handle, waiting. One foot pulled back, taking the majority of his weight, while his free arm came up, hand pointed straight at the bear. The next time the bear opened its mouth to roar, Yukimaru stepped forwards, transferred all his weight to the foot in front and flung the trowel into its mouth like a javelin. At point-blank range with the jaws open wide, it was nearly impossible to miss, even with the trowel not being perfectly balanced for throwing. It slammed into the back of the bear's throat, causing the beast to rear back onto its hind legs for a moment, growl gurgling in its throat. With any luck, it would have caused some internal damage. He might have added a touch of Ryotsu to that throw. Possibly. He actually had no idea whether or not his instincts had overridden his conscious mind in this case. Circling cautiously around the screaming and flailing animal, he made a beeline for his abandoned hoe, spinning around with it in hand to meet the bear face on. Yukimaru growled, nearly subsonic, and although it was much softer than the bear's own outraged yowls, it was clear that his opponent had heard him by the way it reared back again, choking out a snarl in response to his challenge. "You won't hurt anyone again." He sprinted forwards, ducking around a paw, using his momentum to bury the hoe into the bear's skull. The metal bit deep, the shocks running up his arms, and he had to fight the urge to channel Ryotsu through the shaft. There was a dull crack, barely audible over the dying snarls of the beast, and he could feel something, likely the skull, give way. Yukimaru gritted his teeth, forcing the metal blade of the hoe even deeper into the bear's brain. "Come on," he screamed mentally. "Just die already." The bear didn't seem inclined to obey, and he finally had to dive out of the way when the wild flailing became too much to bear. He shook out his numb arms, eyes fixed on the animal thrashing a safe distance away. It was dying, he was sure of it, just very slowly. His hands twitched with the effort of keeping them still, of not putting it out of its misery, but any more and he would run the very real risk of blowing his entire cover. In fact, he wasn't sure if what he had done had already blown his cover. He'd worry about that later. The bear seemed to take an age to die, though realistically speaking it was probably only a few minutes. Yukimaru stood guard solemnly, watching the light fade out of the bear's remaining eye, as its thrashing and struggling slowed, and finally stopped. The ground was splattered with bloodstains as though it was a scene right out of the Minos forest. It wasn't his first kill, not by a long shot, but it was the first time in a long while that he had killed something that wasn't deliberately attacking him. Not since he had become embedded in Masaki and later on Ichigo, in fact. And as an errand car, his kills were quick. Clean. They were never this messy. "I am no longer a hollow." His hand balled into a fist, knuckles whitening. Then the cheers started. Yukimaru startled, for the first time noticing the gathered crowd. He scratched the back of his head slowly. Oops. 4 years. 4 years when he bided his time, and learnt. Kurosaki Ichigo was a hot-headed teenager who charged right into the thick of things, without bothering to take note of the situation beforehand. Eisenhower ensnared that Ichigo within his trap, skillfully manipulating the teenager, crushing him at every opportunity and forcing him to watch as one by one, his allies, his friends, fell. Shihoin Tsuzuki was determined to make a difference. So he learnt. He learned about Aizen's track record, about how his nemesis studied, achieved, and excelled. He learned about how Aizen secretly practiced, honing his skills with Kyoka Suijutsu, until they were on par with the Teiko's connection to his blade. Above all, he learned all that Yoriyuki, Kisuk, and Ishin had to taught him, and forged his own path in the wake of that. Ishin honed his Zenko skills, until Tsuzuki learned to develop his own style. Yoriyuki trained his Hoho and Hakuda, in the true manner of the Onmitsukido, until he could count himself as one of them with pride. And Kisuk, in true cryptical Urahara fashion, gave him not a combat skill, but the gift of patience. The patience to consider a situation before rushing in. The patience to circle around an opponent until the other made a mistake. The patience to train himself, and wait. For long years. He was finally ready. A tornado of Ryotsu met an equally strong tsunami. Two forces of nature collided, again and again, each determined to crush the other. When it was all over, twin figures lay upon the obsidian ground, grinning at each other breathlessly. Tsuzuki opened his eyes. "You were leaking Ryotsu again," remarked Yoriyuki in cat form, perched on his bedside table. A softly pulsing Kido barrier surrounded his bed. Even as he watched, a tendril of Ryotsu escaped his body, only to crash into the barrier and was absorbed by it. Tsuzuki sat up and winced at the sight. "I apologize, Ne-sama." Yukimaru wished for a spar with Shikai activated. Yoriyuki nodded, smoothly shifting to human form and dismissing the Kido spell with a wave of her hand. "This is becoming a frequent occurrence," she stated calmly, no trace of anger in her voice. "Hi, Ne-sama," Tsuzuki answered quietly, head bowed respectfully. "Is the repressor not functioning?" she asked, mindful of the thin walls. Tsuzuki was so used to her switching between methods of speaking that he did not even flinch. "No," he hesitated. "Speak," Yoriyuki urged. "It appears that my Ryotsu reserves are expanding, if that is even possible," Tsuzuki told her, feeling his conclusion was rather ridiculous. There had to be a limit as to how large his reserves could get, right? Instead of laughing it off, Yoriyuki only sighed out loud. "It is possible. I'll contact Kisuk to design a new one. With capacity for exponential growth, this time." Out loud, she added, "Get dressed and report at the academy in 2 hours' time. Lessons are cancelled for the day." The Ryotsu repressor became a necessary addition after Tsuzuki lost control over his vast reserves just days after his induction into the clan. Upset by the initiation of a Rokanga resident into their prestigious clan, several younger members banded together to teach him a lesson, as they called it. In the middle of the night, they had sneaked into his room, hoping to catch him off guard. It was by pure luck that Tsuzuki had expended a significant portion of his reserves in a spar with Yukimaru in their mindscape just the night before, and they had yet to refill. Startled awake when their proximity tripped off his Ryotsu sensors, an ingrained habit after years in the war, he leapt off his futon only to see a few teenagers cowering, forced to the ground by his Ryotsu pressure alone. No one challenged him after that incident. Yoriuki managed to smooth things over by explaining away the sudden rise in Ryotsu level as a part of Tsuzuki's growth spurt induced by exposure to high concentrations of Ryotsu, but it was evident that another slip-up would be potentially disastrous. Hours after the incident, Kisuke took another poison-inventing break to build Tsuzuki his first Ryotsu repressor. Being short on time, how Kisuke had managed to replicate Mayuri's invention in less than a day, Tsuzuki had no idea, but he was very grateful. The first repressor strongly resembled Zaraki Kenpaku's eye patch. In fact, it was a patch, just one hidden within his hakama, and boy had that been uncomfortable. Subsequent ones saw improvements in leaps and bounds, from design to functionality. Tsuzuki stripped off his sleeve yukata, his gaze falling on the simple chain hanging around his neck. A pendant adorned with the Shihoin crest, this was the fifth repressor to date and the second one he could wear in public. Keyed to his Ryotsu signature, the pendant siphoned any Ryotsu above the preset level. It even had an adjustable preset level now, that might escape his control and stored the excess, somewhere. Kisuke was muttering about additional dimensions, and Tsuzuki had wisely decided that he really did not need to know so long as the repressor worked. He only hoped Kisuke did not build the new repressor in the shape of something embarrassing this time, like that cat effigy he was threatening to do if Tsuzuki needed another one. Oops. Dressed as befitting a noble of his position, Tsuzuki adopted his best Byakuya, the future one, not the little brat he was now, impersonation and set off towards the academy. He was met at the door by a portly, well-dressed old man. "Good morning, I am Shihoin Tsuzuki, here to take the placement tests for the academy." Tsuzuki bowed formally, hands clasped before him. The old man smiled, bowing back in acknowledgement. "Good morning Shihoin Tsuzuki-san, I am Onabora Jengoro, director of the academy, and I will be conducting your placement tests for today. This way please." Tsuzuki was led down a corridor, ending in an ornate dojo. Tatami mats were already laid out on the floor, and to his inward surprise there was already a crowd of spectators forming. Yoriuki Nesama was an obvious figure, as were her second seat, so iPhone and third seat, Kisuke. Ishine had told him that the 3rd Division Teiko had wanted a representative, and therefore his father was beside them. Jinrei Teiko and Byakuya were probably there to observe the heir of a fellow clan. What was surprising, however, was the presence of a reasonable number of other division representatives, among them Kiraku Teiko, Yukatake Teiko, and Anohana Teiko. And, Tsuzuki felt a chill go up his spine, Aizen Sosuke himself. Tsuzuki only heard Aizen vaguely as the other explained to a curious Kiraku Teiko that Shinji, Hirako Teiko, had asked him to observe the Shihoin heir's first debut in public. All that mattered was that Aizen was there, not to mention Shinigami from at least 7 divisions. He turned to face Onabora, resolved to put up a good show. "First, we will be testing your skills in Hakuda," Onabora explained as he dropped into a battle-ready stance. "Come." Tsuzuki instantly leapt into the air, springing for Onabora's stomach. The world narrowed down to a single focus as he spotted the minute tensing in Onabora's muscles just in time for him to avoid the knee snapping up towards his chin. Rolling his body sideways, Tsuzuki made a few quick jabs at Onabora's vital points, assessing his opponent. The exchange complete, he sprang back, bouncing lightly on the balls of his feet, thinking furiously. Yoriuki smirked at the boy's performance. The fluid, almost unconscious grace Tsuzuki now fought with and the calculating gleam in his eye, so much unlike Ichigo's street brawl style, proved beyond a shadow of doubt that she was right in spotting the boy's potential. Though Hakuda had hardly been Ichigo's weakness, years of karate lessons and being picked up by bullies had ensured that his style, while aesthetically unappealing, was at least effective. He was no match for masters such as iPhone. Now, however, now Tsuzuki could give any of the Onmitsukido a run for their money, save for perhaps Kisuke and herself. Tsuzuki was now pressed on the defensive, Onabora pressing on relentlessly as the duo traded blows. Stepping back, Onabora inclined his head briefly, and disappeared in a whisper of air. Tsuzuki snapped his head around, leg already extended to block Onobora's high kick as his arm snaked out in a lightning-quick punch that Onobora barely avoided. Onobora's eyes widened as he felt a graze against his side even though no physical contact was made. His mental evaluation of the boy went up a few notches. So young yet already able to effectively concentrate Ryotsu to a part of his body. He had seen enough. Stop. Tsuzuki instantly pulled back his arm and stood at attention, breathing a little heavily but otherwise none the worse for wear. Next, Zanjutsu. Tsuzuki retrieved his wooden training buken from the side of the dojo, the very one Kisuke had made for him 4 years ago. In fact, it was a miracle the abused piece of wood had not broken long ago, and settled into the beginning position of his first kata. Onobora returned to the center of the room with a standard buken, the kind issued to all academy students who had not discovered their Zanpakuto spirits yet, and ran an appraising glance down the slim piece of wood in Tsuzuki's hands. Tsuzuki smirked. Everybody underestimated Tensei Zanjutsu simply because it was not flashy or big. During the war, newly minted Arankar often swarmed him, believing him to relatively harmless as compared to the massive ice dragon or the gigantic coil that was Hyozabameru. They were soon proven wrong. Begin. Instead of charging forward this time, Tsuzuki simply waited, eyes sweeping across Onobora's body. He could see that the examiner was confused at his behavior, but opting to wait. It was up to him to make the first move. A clash of buken. Onobora's eyes widened. Tsuzuki was fast, much faster than before, and on top of it he had not sensed a drop of Ryotsu usage. Which meant, this was the boy's natural speed. Around them, the peanut gallery began chattering out loud. Tsuzuki vaguely heard Jayashiro exclaiming. They clashed buken a few times, each straining to overpower the other, but neither succeeding. Finally Tsuzuki decided it was enough. Onobora's full concentration was on the boy standing before him, until he felt a light tap on his neck and turned his head to see Tsuzuki behind him. Unable to help himself, he gasped and snapped his head back, just in time to see the Tsuzuki before him dispel. Way of Onmitsu, third of the Shiho, Utsasimi, state Tsuzuki calmly. He removed his buken from Onobora's neck and stepped back, bowing deeply. Astonished, Onobora could only bow back. In the viewer's gallery, Yoriyuki smirked and preened. Utsasimi, one of her own inventions, allowed for a movement at great speed, leaving an afterimage behind. She had once taught it to a much older Byakuya, but this time Tsuzuki would be her first student. It would not do for another clan to learn a Shihoin clan technique before the clan heir himself, of course. Are you watching, Aizen Sosuke? She thought to herself. Full of promise with a touch of headstrong attitude, Aizen's favorite combination. Are you interested yet? The Kido portion of the test took part in another area of the academy, where there were a row of targets lined up. Perform any 5 Bakudo or Heido spells on the targets, 2 of which must be Bakudo and another 2 Heido, instructed Onobora. Tsuzuki nodded to show his understanding. Yoriyuki had discussed it at length with him, as even with the Ryotsu repressor in place his control was shaky, and now without it, of all the days to break his Ryotsu repressor. He gritted his teeth. He would have to try harder then. It was a good thing a significant portion of his Ryotsu was already spent on the morning spar with Yukimaru, which was the very point of the spar in the first place. Taking a deep breath, he incanted clearly, "Ya Lord. Mask of flesh and bone, flutter of wings, Ya who bears the name of man. Truth and temperance, upon this sinless wall of dreams unleash but slightly the wrath of your claws. Heido no Sunju-san, so Keisui." A wave of Ryotsu emanated from his outstretched palm, slamming into the target and completely obliterating it. Tsuzuki winced. Rein it in a little more, Yoriyuki suddenly advised, her voice echoing in his head. Tsuzuki only outwardly blinked, already used to her random mental intrusions, and gathered his Ryotsu once more. Disintegrate, you black dog of Rondonini. Look upon yourself with horror and then claw out your own throat. Bakudo no Kyu, Kaki. Drawing the 3 symbols in the air, Tsuzuki's body briefly glowed red before the red energy engulfed the next hapless wooden target. Glancing sideways, he spotted Onobora nodding slowly in approval, which bolstered his confidence to continue. Heido no Sunjuichi, Shakaho. An orb of crimson energy formed from his palm, and this time it was exactly the size he wanted it to be. Thank Kami for small miracles. It blasted out from his palm and slammed dead center into the wooden target, drilling through the bullseye and fizzing out on the other sides. Inspecting the target cursorily, Tsuzuki smiled at the slightly charred edges of the hole he had created. His next and last compulsory binding spell was one of So-iPhone's favorites, which she had rather reluctantly taught him. He would do her proud. Bakudo no Sunju, Shitosu Sansen. He maneuvered the burst of crackling yellow Ryotsu in his palm into the shape of an inverted yellow triangle, which in turn generated solidified energy in the shape of triangles from the 3 points of the inverted triangle. The spell flew forth, the solidified triangles slamming into place on 3 points of the wooden target, knocking it over. His compulsory 4 Kido complete, Tsuzuki turned to the examiner. I would like to request a barrier to demonstrate my last Kido. Yuryuki's eyebrows shot up. So this was what Tsuzuki had in mind when he told her that he had an idea for his last Kido test, and specifically asked what levels of Kido should he realistically demonstrate. Of course. Having that much Ryotsu, the few Kido Tsuzuki ever learned during the war was to annihilate, and annihilate some more. She did not think he even knew a single Kido spell under number 50 before he was thrown back in time. Looking unruffled by the request, the boy had surprised him enough today. Onabora calmly incanted, Bakudo no Hakihuichi, Danku. A translucent barrier in the form of a large rectangular wall appeared, shielding the watchers. The assorted Shinigami widened their eyes as Tsuzuki began to chant. Sprinkled on the bones of the beast. Sharp tower, red crystal, steel ring. Move and become the wind, stop and become the calm. The sound of warring spears fills the empty castle. Heido no Rokuju-san, Reikoho. He thrust his palm forth, towards the translucent barrier. The wall of crackling yellow energy generated suddenly condensed into a lightning spear, sharpening and striking at the center of the barrier with impossible speed and force. Onabora actually staggered backward from the onslaught. Yuryuki smothered a smile. If they were impressed by a mere Reikoho, they should have seen Ichigo's Heido number 88, Hiri Yujikazaku Shinten Reiho. The size of a skyscraper, that discharge of electrical and spiritual energy equivalent to that of a lower-ranked seated Shinigami put even Tessai's best efforts to shame. No wonder it was Ichigo's favorite Kido. Too bad Tsuzuki could not perform that. She would have loved to see the looks on their faces. Wiping his brow, Onabora stepped back and bowed. Thank you very much, Shiho and Tsuzuki-san. I believe this test has adequately demonstrated your skill level, and there is no doubt you would do well in the first class. Thank you very much, Tsuzuki replied, bowing back. Kisuke was waiting for them in the hideout, smirking and tossing a parcel up and down. Upon noticing their approach, he threw the parcel to Tsuzuki, who barely managed to dive after it. So, Tsuzuki-bo, surely you heard me when I told you not to break the repressor again, didn't you? Tsuzuki gulped at Kisuke's evil expression and unwrapped the parcel. It was a hairband. With 2 cat-shaped ears. Tsuzuki twitched. What the hell is this? He shrieked, the hairband dangling from his grasp as far away from him as possible, as though it was poisonous. Careful now, wouldn't want to break it, would you? Kisuke admonished, smirking. Yuryuki broke into guffaws, nearly crying with laughter as she pointed at the offensive item. Kisuke practically sparkled. You know, you're at that age whereby you're leaving home for the academy, so don't you want a memento of your dearest Onisama, who saved you from a life of hardship and abandonment in the streets of Rukanga? He mimed, wagging the cat ears. Said Onisama was now rolling around the floor in hysterical laughter, clutching her stomach. Tsuzuki snarled, dropping the hairband and leaping for Kisuke's throat. Still cackling, Kisuke blocked his lunge casually with one hand, using Tsuzuki's Ryotsu-enhanced momentum to toss the boy over his shoulder. Tsuzuki landed in a handstand, legs already sweeping at Kisuke's upper body. Kisuke grabbed an ankle in midair, and twisted. Instead of crying out in pain, Tsuzuki smoothly adapted his body to twist along with his leg, using Kisuke's hold as leverage to pull himself towards the other man, fists blazing with Ryotsu. Kisuke's eyes widened, his other arm coming up to block against the fists, his own Ryotsu levels rocketing in response. Despite cushioning the blow, the sting jarred his hold on Tsuzuki's leg, so much so that he had to let the boy go. Tsuzuki sprang back in a ready stance, eyes burning with murder. He was shocked, therefore, when Kisuke threw his head back and began to laugh again. The only thing stopping him from strangling the man with his bare hands was that the laughter was not mocking this time. Frowning, Tsuzuki dropped his battle stance and waited for the duo to finish, expressing their merriment. You are still way too easy to tease, Kisuke snickered, finally getting his laughter under control. Tsuzuki raised an eyebrow. Still chortling lightly, Kisuke reached into his pocket, and withdrew another, smaller box. He opened the box to reveal a pendant identical to the one currently around Tsuzuki's neck. Then what the hell is that? Tsuzuki yelled, pointing at the discarded hairband. Kisuke stared at him as though he was mad. A hairband with fluffy cat ears, the third seat informed him. Yuriyuki wandered over and picked it up. I wonder if so iPhone would like this? She mused out loud. Tsuzuki clapped a hand to his forehead. Grudgingly, he had to admit that they got him. Then what's the point of the hairband? To make you smile. Appreciate the fact that you're alive. Let us appreciate the fact that you're alive, Yuriyuki told him, and if not for the smile in her eyes, Tsuzuki could almost believe she was dead serious. So, how many targets did he blow up during the Kido test? Kisuke inquired casually. Tsuzuki groaned as Yuriyuki gleefully launched into an embellished tale of his Sokei-sui disaster.
So yeah, guys, that's it. I totally forgot if this went on a little bit longer than it should have. I'm sorry. And yeah, I just did not figure out that it already ended and it's fucking 3 hours long. So yeah, understandable. So hope you all guys enjoyed. Hope to see you next time. See you guys. Bye.